Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And this is a lecture for patrons. Myth of the Month, number 24, The Epic of Gilgamesh, Part 2, Analysis. And this lecture is brought to you by the letter Z. So in part 1 on the Epic of Gilgamesh, I discussed where this very ancient story came from, how it's been rediscovered and reconstructed in the modern world. So I more or less traced the history of that epic, going from what we know of the actual historical Gilgamesh in the 2000s BC up to modern translations. So what I've been putting off and what I want to do now is looking at the epic as a piece of literature, for its style, the way it's constructed, and the different levels of meaning that one can take from it as a poem, as a narrative, and as a myth. So to begin with, this narrative is in verse. So it is broken into lines of roughly similar length on the tablets where it was inscribed. But it doesn't seem as if it's exactly metrical verse. We don't know exactly how all the words are pronounced, but it doesn't seem as if there's any clear rule of syllables or stressed syllables in each line. However, the lines do seem to be laid out as what are called double lines, where basically they comprise two phrases roughly similar in length and rhythm, which can give the text a sort of swaying beat as you read through it line by line. And it also seems to have partial or irregular rhymes, which gives a vague sense of repetition. So in researching this, I wanted to get some sense of how the text sounded, whether in Sumerian or Akkadian. And it happens that, as far as I was able to find, there is one place online, which is a website put up by SOAS, or the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where they have posted recordings by professional Assyriologists and other scholars reading passages of various ancient texts in Akkadian, that Semitic language that I talked about, of which Old Babylonian and Standard Babylonian are dialects. And it seems that these scholars basically use their best guesses as to the sound and pronunciation of the ancient texts. And the page, which I'll link to in the description, includes several readings by a number of different scholars from the beginning of Tablet 11 of the Standard Babylonian recension. And I asked SOAS if I could use clips from these recordings, and as of yet they haven't gotten back to me, so I'm just going to give my own rendering of the opening 10 lines of Tablet 11, which is the one that discusses the story of the Great Flood. And I'll read to you the English translation as provided by SOAS, and then my best attempt at the Akkadian, as based more or less on the recordings on that site. So the tablet begins with Gilgamesh confronting Utnapishtim and insisting that the man give him the secret of his immortality. And Utnapishtim, in response, says that he's going to give Gilgamesh a great secret, which turns out to be the flood story. So in the English translation it reads, Gilgamesh spoke to him, to Utnapishtim the far away. As I look at you, Utnapishtim, your form is no different. You are just like me. You are not different at all. You are just like me. I was fully intent on doing battle with you, but in your presence my hand is stayed. How was it that you attended the gods' assembly and found eternal life? Utnapishtim spoke to him, to Gilgamesh. I will disclose to you, Gilgamesh, a secret matter, and I will tell you a mystery of the gods. So it seems that the original text in Standard Babylonian sounds something like this. Gilgamesh ana shashuma izakara ana Utnapishtim ruki. Anata lakuma Utnapishti, minatuka alshana, kiyati ma'ata, uata alshanata, kiyati ma'ata, gumurka libi ana epesh tukunti, ahinadat elutserika, akiki tazizi napuhur ilani balata teshu, Utnapishti ana shashuma, izakra ana Gilgamesh, lupteka Gilgamesh, amat nitsirti, upirishti shailani kasha lukpika. So perhaps you can hear in the sound of those lines this sort of lilting and swaying sound, right? As each line comes through as almost a call and response, a first phrase and a second phrase, with a lot of the same sounds and stresses roughly repeating. So you can imagine hearing hundreds of lines like that could easily become kind of hypnotic. And you may have noticed the repetition of, in this case, Gilgamesh saying, "You are just like me," and again, "You are just like me." Ki yati ma'ata, ki yati ma'ata. And there is repetition like this of various different sorts, woven all through the entire narrative. Words, phrases, sometimes entire lines, entire speeches, and also the sort of forms and templates of events, which happen in kind of repeating sets and numbers. And especially, as Michael Schmidt has pointed out, there's a repetition of the number 7, as if the world of the story is somehow structured into sets and series of 7. And Michael Schmidt writes, quote, "Enkidu downs 7 jugs of beer. The monster Humbaba has 7 auras. The city gates have 7 bolts. 7 mountain chains are crossed to get to the cedar forest. The 7 judges of hell make lightning at the deluge. 7 sages laid the foundations of Uruk. 7 and then another 7 cauldrons of incense are lighted after the deluge to entice the gods," and so on. End quote. Now, within this, I would say there's even a further pattern, which is likely revealing, which is the repeating period of 6 days and 7 nights. So, for instance, Enkidu engages, in the first part of the story, he engages in sex with Shamhat for 6 days and 7 nights. Then after Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh holds on to his body for 6 days and 7 nights. When Gilgamesh makes it to the island of Utnapishtim and wants the secret of immortality, he falls asleep for 6 days and 7 nights. So these sorts of repetition of numbers and of periods of time seem to represent something about the cycle of life and death and the sort of inexorability of time. And they also create a sort of rhythm to the text. The text rhymes with itself, not just in terms of words at the end of a line, but in terms of markers that structure the story. On a greater scale, there's also repetition of entire speeches, which often come back word for word, especially in sets of 2 or 3. Perhaps the most significantly, early on, before Enkidu comes to Uruk and before they meet, Gilgamesh has 2 dreams, which he tells to his mother, Ninsun, which she then interprets. As you'll see, a lot of the exact same text repeats, both in the account of the dream and in the way the mother interprets it. So this is a really interesting and significant passage, I think, for a lot of reasons that will come up all through the rest of this lecture. But I will just read to you Andrew George's 2003 translation of this point in the narrative from the first tablet. So it reads, quote, "Gilgamesh arose to reveal a dream, saying to his mother, 'O mother, the dream that I saw in the course of this night, the stars of the heaven appeared before me, like lumps of rock from the sky. They kept falling towards me. I picked one up, but it was too much for me. I kept trying to roll it, but I could not dislodge it. The land of Uruk was standing around it. The land was gathered about it. A crowd was jostling before it, the menfolk thronging about it. They were kissing its feet like a little baby's. I loved it like a wife, and I caressed and embraced it. I picked it up and set it down at your feet, and you made it my equal.' The mother of Gilgamesh was clever, she was wise, she knew everything. She said to her son, 'Wild cow Ninsun was clever, she was wise, she knew everything.' She said to Gilgamesh, 'The stars of heaven appeared before you. Like a lump of rock from the sky, one fell toward you. You picked it up, but it was too much for you. You kept trying to roll it, but you could not dislodge it. You picked it up and set it down at my feet, and I made it your equal. And you loved it like a wife, caressing and embracing it. A mighty companion will come to you, the savior of his friend. He is the mightiest in the land. He has strength. His strength is as mighty as a lump of rock from the sky. You will love him like a wife, caressing and embracing him. He, being mighty, will often save you. Favorable and precious was your dream. He saw a second dream. He arose and entered before the goddess, his mother. Gilgamesh said to her, to his mother, "And again, O mother, I have seen a second dream. In a street of Uruk, the city center, an axe was lying and people were gathered around it. The land of Uruk was standing around it. The land was gathered about it. A crowd was jostling before it. The menfolk were thronging around it. I picked it up and set it down at your feet. I loved it like a wife, and I caressed and embraced it. And you made it my equal. The mother of Gilgamesh was clever. She was wise. She knew everything. She said to her son, Wild Cow Ninsun was clever. She was wise. She knew everything. She said to Gilgamesh, My son, the axe you saw is a man. You will love him like a wife, and will caress and embrace him, and I shall make him your equal. A mighty companion will come to you, the savior of his friend. He is the mightiest in the land. He has strength. His strength is as mighty as a lump of rock from the sky. Gilgamesh said to her, to his mother, O mother, by Counselor Enlil's command may it befall me. I will acquire a friend, a counselor. A friend, a counselor, I will acquire. Thus he has seen his dreams. So there's a great deal in this passage that is very suggestive and meaningful for the structure of the story, the nature of the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And for one thing, this is the first point in the story where we get a description of prophetic dreams, which then become an important repeating motif and really motivating factor through all the rest of the story. And if you look in this passage, you surely have heard as I read it, the levels and layers of repetition. For one thing, there's the repetition of one dream and then the next, which are recounted in almost the exact same words, with only small differences. What was the object? In one, it was a rock that fell from the sky, which of course sounds like a meteorite coming down in a meteor shower. And then the second one is an axe found in the center of the city. But the way the two dreams are narrated is almost identical. And then furthermore, if you look into each half of this passage, first the one about the meteorite dream and then the second one about the axe dream, it involves Gilgamesh describing his dream with a lot of repetitive language and then Ninsun repeating it back to him, repeating several lines and phrases exactly verbatim. So there's a repetition within repetition. And then in the particular phrasing, there are transitional points where the narrator tells us the sequence of this exchange. And it too, the narrator themselves uses this repetition, but with slight changes to sort of add tension and interest. So for instance, when Gilgamesh has described his dream and he concludes, then the narrator tells us, the mother of Gilgamesh was clever, she was wise, she knew everything, she said to her son. So at that point we might expect her words to come through, but instead the narrator repeats, Wild Cow Ninsun was clever, she was wise, she knew everything, she said to Gilgamesh. And this is a motif that comes back over and over again through the whole poem, where the narrator will name a person by who they are, by their identity, right? So first he talks about Ninsun and calls her the mother of Gilgamesh, and then says she was speaking to her son. Then when those lines are repeated, now the names are used. Wild Cow Ninsun was clever, she was wise, she knew everything, she said to Gilgamesh. Not to her son, but to Gilgamesh. It uses the actual personal name. And I don't know why this is exactly, that the poem keeps doing this over and over again, but it seems to have some sort of purpose. It's some way of drilling into your mind the particular identities and roles of each of these characters that are sort of wrapped up in their identity or their personality. And the same sort of thing happens back in that opening that I read in the first lecture, which starts off with, he who knew the deep was wise in all matters. And then it repeats, Gilgamesh who knew the deep. Right? So first we're told about people sort of in the abstract, and then the line repeats and we get their actual name. So I think that this may be the longest passage of actual repeated lines coming back over and over verbatim. But later in the story, we get other speeches that repeat coming from different characters, sometimes 2 or even 3 of them. And a really great example of that is when Gilgamesh is on his sort of final quest in the later tablets. And he goes off in search of Utnapishtim, and he encounters different figures over the course of this journey, each of whom tries to discourage him and turn him back home to Uruk. One of these is the divine barmaid Shiduri, who keeps the inn in that sort of sacred garden by the seacoast. And as we saw, she sees him approaching and is disturbed, right? This guy's looking ragged and hollow-eyed, and so she retreats inside and bars the door. And when she speaks with Gilgamesh, she expresses sort of shock at his haggard appearance. And she says, quote, "Why are your cheeks so hollow, your face so sunken, your mood so wretched, your visage so wasted? Why in your heart does sorrow reside, and your face resemble one come from afar? Why are your features burnt by frost and by sunshine, and why do you wander the wild in lion's garb?" So this is a little speech in 6 lines, or you could see it as kind of 3 couplets, each of which is a complete question. So it has this sort of repetitive tripartite structure. And then when Gilgamesh moves on to the seashore and finds the boatman Urshanabi repeats this exact same speech again upon seeing him. And then a 3rd time when Gilgamesh lands on the island, Utnapishtim sees him and says this same exact speech over again. And furthermore, as I said, it has this sort of tripartite repetitive internal structure, and it repeats 3 times. So it's a sort of 3 upon 3. Now, perhaps the most extreme repetitive passage, just in terms of exact verbatim repetition, is probably the point where Gilgamesh is passing through the long tunnel. And as I said, it takes him 12 hours. And the way it's narrated, the narrator says over and over again, he walked for a 5th hour and it was entirely dark. He could see nothing in front of him and nothing behind him. A 6th hour, he could see nothing in front of him and nothing behind him, over and over again, until finally, as the tension builds up, arguably, finally we hear he felt a bit of wind on his face. And then finally, the 12th hour, he was suddenly stepping out into sunlight. And, I find it very evocative because it sort of reminds me of standing on a subway platform, especially, in the dark at night. And you're just really waiting for that train to come, and you don't know if it's ever going to come. And the first thing that indicates that a train is coming is the movement of air, which you often feel first on your face. And then you see the little bit of light coming around the bend of the tunnel, and then suddenly the train is there. So it's a very sensory experience that I think that passage brings to life. But reading it on the page, it doesn't really work. Like, you see what's going on, and you see that it's repeated hour after hour, and so you just skip ahead. And trying to actually read a repetitive passage like that 7, 8, 9 times over, it just becomes tedious. But if you imagine reading it aloud or hearing it read or recited, it's not so tedious. There's a sort of hypnotic quality. And I think that's part of why that extensive repetition is used in that passage where Gilgamesh reports his dreams to Ninsun, because that sort of rhythmic repetition creates a kind of dreamlike, surreal mood, and it's about dreams. So this kind of repetition, I think, is a reason to suppose that this epic, even the standard Babylonian recension that was found in the Library of Ashurbanipal, was originally composed orally, or perhaps was edited and composed for the purpose of being read and performed out loud. And this is a pretty widely held understanding among scholars and translators of the epic, that it was originally oral or intended to be oral. But this is not a universal consensus. So some scholars like Michael Schmidt, who I quoted earlier, cautions that we don't really know that, and there are some reasons to think that perhaps that is an anachronistic assumption based on later epics like the Homeric epics that were clearly composed in an oral tradition. And I would also observe that the language of the standard Babylonian recension, as I said, seems to be a sort of literary language, and we don't know how many people actually spoke it or would have understood it when they hear it spoken aloud. So there is some room for doubt or ambiguity here. And this sort of ambiguity actually is reflected in the opening lines of the epic from Tablet 1, which different translators have translated differently. So when the narrator instructs the reader to take the tablet out of the cedar chest, it then says either read the travails of Gilgamesh or read out the travails of Gilgamesh. And different translations differ on this point. And you can imagine reading seems to just mean like the way we would read a book today, whereas read out implies recite it for an audience. And we can't know exactly how this text was encountered and received in ancient times, but I tend to think it must have been oral. It must have been intended, at least, to be performed out loud, because one has to ask how many people in that age were even literate, or if they were, how many of them could get their hands on a tablet with the complete epic. I tend to think that just thinking materially and practically, most likely there were only a small number of copies of the standard Babylonian recension, right? And the only even close to complete set that's ever been found is at the Library of Ashurbanipal. There are not many copies of that recension around. The other surviving tablets are either older recensions or the Hittite version. So I would tend to think there probably were a small number of copies kept as sort of valued possessions in special safe locations, right? That's why the opening says it's in a chest with a lock, it's inscribed in lapis lazuli, which is a precious material. So there were probably a limited number of copies that were taken out and read aloud, probably as part of ceremonial occasions or festivities. That would be my best guess. And another reason that I noticed and that I would emphasize why I think it's much more likely that this was an oral composition is the prevalence of sounds. There's great sound imagery, some of it from objects that you can almost imagine, like the bolts on the gates of Uruk being opened and closed. Also, as I've mentioned before, the chest that unlocks and opens, which I think you almost can't resist imagining in your mind the sounds. I added in a sound effect because I have a couple of old trunks at home and I sort of couldn't resist it. And there are also all kinds of dramatic, loud noises that punctuate the important moments in this epic, such as in the first meeting between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, where they wrestle and the walls shake and the doorpost is broken. And in the dreams in the forest, when the two men are approaching Humbaba's lair, and we hear of the rumbling earth and the crumbling and collapsing mountains. And then in the flood narrative, the pouring rain and thunder. There's also the frequent appearance of animals with the sounds that they make. There are several repeated references to the snorting of the bull of heaven. So reading the poem, I was noticing this sort of dramatic references to the loud noises of animals. And then as I read Schmidt's book, he refers to another ancient tablet that's been found and translated in more recent years in Iraq, which may have been from some older recension. This describes Enkidu and Gilgamesh entering into the forest, and it refers to the resin oozing out, forming amber on the trees. And then it says, quote, "Throughout the forest bird life was chirping, answering each other in rhythmic din. A pigeon was cooing, a turtle dove answering. The forest was joyous with the cry of the stork. The forest was abundantly joyous from the lilt of the francolin. Mother monkeys kept up their calls. Baby monkeys squeaked. Like a band of musicians and drummers, they sounded all day long in the presence of Humbaba." So again, I can't imagine reading a text like that and not being tempted to make these noises of birds and monkeys. And it's my theory, I really suspect that when this epic was performed through the years, it was accompanied by sound effects. Why wouldn't you? You probably had people with little instruments, whistles, drums to embellish and bring to life this story in sound. Now, to be totally fair, it's not just auditory imagery. There are spare, striking visual images that also flash to life. For example, in the seaside garden, we're told of gemstones like pearls and carnelians growing on the trees and bushes like berries. Now, that's one instance where we get this sort of stark, shining image related to us by the narrator. But much more so, these sorts of images come out in people's speeches, right? There's a lot of extended speeches all through the cycle. And that's where we often get the most kind of vivid and even shocking images. Like, as I mentioned last time, Gilgamesh describing seeing a maggot fall from Enkidu's nose. Another example from a relatively minor character is Humbaba's taunting of Gilgamesh and Enkidu as they approach his lair on the mountain. And Humbaba's speech has a remarkable sort of vivid, violent beauty. As he says, "Come, Enkidu, you spawn of a fish who knew no father, hatchling of terrapin and turtle who sucked no mother's milk. Now in treachery you bring before me Gilgamesh. I will slit the throat and gullet of Gilgamesh. I will feed his flesh to the locust bird, the ravening eagle and vulture." So over and over again, this is how characters speak in these different scenes. Their speech, it's very concrete and vivid. And most of all, I think this comes through in the story of the flood. That story on Tablet 11 is arguably the great masterpiece of the cycle. And it is also a speech, right? It's Utnapishtim relating his story, and it conveys dramatic, almost unimaginable scenes of disaster and drama through short metaphors with striking or shocking imagery. For instance, the Anunnaki, the judges of the underworld, are said to arise out of their underworld lair into the air and clouds and ignite their torches, as a reference presumably to lightning. The land is shattered like a cup. The ocean thrashes like a woman in labor. The gods are seen like dogs cowering against a wall in fear. And the goddess Ishtar describes the dead people floating in the waves of the water like fish spawn on a lake. And afterwards, as the storm recedes, the gods are described as swarming on Utnapishtim's offering altars like flies. And all of these images, I think, seem to appear in this part of the story because they are so searing, and so they survived through many centuries of retelling. And the recension that we find from Nineveh is really, you could say, a distillation of what persisted the most vividly in the mind, what was most haunting. And specifically in the flood story, the imagery all seems to underscore how not only man and earthly life, but also even the gods are flawed and fragile. And beyond these striking images, the text also has more extended metaphors, which are often complex and highly ambiguous. And this can be seen especially in the interpretation of the dreams. For instance, in Gilgamesh's dreams, which I read to you about the meteorite and the axe, which Ninsun understands to represent Enkidu, there's some tension and ambiguity here because the two objects are quite different. One is raw and unformed, it's enormous and ungainly. The other is finely made and sharp. One is found somewhere out in the wild, having fallen from the sky. The other somehow appears in the street of the city. And yet Ninsun interprets them both in the same way, even using the exact same words. And why is this? Perhaps the two objects might represent different aspects of the same man. Perhaps the raw and the formed. So if we think of the meteorite as sort of the raw material falling from heaven, It is reminiscent of the clay out of which Enkidu was shaped and sent down to earth by the gods, whereas the axe is formed and finished, so perhaps that represents Enkidu in his second form as a civilized man, right? A man of the city, a partner of Gilgamesh, no longer a wild creature. And it happens that in some parts of the world where iron ore is very scarce, weapons like axes are sometimes made from meteorite iron. If that's the only source you have, then that is what the blacksmiths will use. So perhaps there's a sort of metaphor there, tracing the arc, the transformation of Enkidu from raw to formed. Or perhaps you might see it in a negative light as changing from peaceable to violent. Right? The meteorite is heavenly. Gilgamesh is drawn to it as something appealing and wonderful, but then it ends up turning into an axe, into something violent and destructive, which is ultimately what Enkidu also becomes. He's the one who eggs on Gilgamesh to kill Humbaba and show no mercy. He's the one who mutilates the bull of heaven and throws a body part at Ishtar, thus bringing on his own death. So there is this deep ambiguity here. Why does he appear in Gilgamesh's dreams in these two different forms? Do these things really match and harmonize? What does it mean? And even beyond that, is Ninsun correct that these two objects both represent Enkidu? Or is this just somehow convenient? Is this an overly optimistic interpretation, much as Enkidu's interpretation of Gilgamesh's dreams on the mountain, which seem to reflect explosions, collapsing mountains, fire, that those represent victory and are positive? All of this is questionable and ambiguous. So again, in that case, Enkidu sees these catastrophic dreams as representing their imminent defeat of Humbaba, but he fails to foresee that in a sense they also can be seen to foreshadow his own death. There's a parallel and a similarity between Enkidu and Humbaba. As Humbaba himself points out, they're both sort of unformed raw creatures of the wild. They have both been outsiders, outside civilization. And so their destruction of Humbaba starts the chain of events that ultimately leads to the demise of Enkidu as well. So this sort of ambiguity then extends further also to the strange and otherworldly images in the poem, like the jewels growing on the bushes in the sacred garden. So on one level, clearly this can represent immortality. This is a garden where instead of perishable fruits like berries or apples, we see these emeralds and pearls, which are eternal and do not decay, and hence it can be seen to represent the transcendence of mortality. But also at the same time, it can be seen to represent sterility, right? These are fruits that are frozen in time and that cannot be eaten. They have no fragrance, they have no taste, and they have no sustenance. So the garden, in a sense, is fruitless and sterile, and perhaps this prefigures then the fruitless nature of Gilgamesh's quest to extend his life. So on all levels and all scales, this rich metaphorical language is very ambiguous, and further it can be seen, I think, to embed subtle ironies, especially often the failures of the characters to see how their own actions or ambitions are self-defeating. So in fact, I would say the epic is woven through with clever and often subtle ironies. One that is more obvious is in the deluge narrative, where the god Ea is giving instructions to Utnapishtim, right, to help him escape and survive the flood. And Utnapishtim needs to know, what am I going to tell the people of my city, Shuruppak, to explain why I'm running away and what will happen after I'm gone. And so the god tells Utnapishtim to promise the people of Shuruppak that once you leave, they will enjoy prosperity and, quote, a shower of bread cakes and a torrent of wheat. So there's this pointed irony where he's using this metaphorical language, right, a shower and a torrent, to represent a coming abundance. And yet, ironically, it is literal showers and torrents that are coming to hit them. And one has to wonder why. Why is there this weird embedded resonance? Is it just an unconscious association on the part of the god Ea that he knows that what's really coming is a flood, so he uses this ironic metaphor? Or is there even perhaps a kind of sadistic toying with the victims of this coming disaster, right? Dropping hints of what's about to come. And you can see, I think this passage has an echo, maybe conscious, maybe coincidental. I think there's an echo in Game of Thrones when the sort of nefarious, scheming magnate Walder Frey welcomes in the Starks for a wedding in his castle, and he boasts that the wine will flow red. If you've read the book or watched the show, you know that this is not going to turn out well. And in retrospect, you can see there's this sort of sadistic, ironic metaphor here. Walder Frey is not really thinking about flowing red wine. So this sort of irony that I just pointed out, which you can see in the language of the flood story, it's very dark, but nonetheless it raises the question, which I think is worth thinking about, is this epic funny? Would people have laughed when they heard lines like this? And I do think that's very possible, but it could only be appreciated. A lot of this irony is extremely dark and can only be appreciated with a dark, fatalistic sense of humor, rooted in a sort of sense of the dark irony of life and human affairs. And in this vein, I was struck by a particular line. So near the end of Tablet 11, when Gilgamesh is returning on his way back to Uruk, he obtains this sort of herb of restored youth, but then a snake steals it and takes it away. And Gilgamesh is upset. He's gone to great lengths to find this object. He's risked his life by diving under the sea. And now he laments his failure, coming back from this long, arduous journey with nothing to show for it. And in Benjamin Foster's translation, he laments, quote, "For myself I have obtained no benefit. I have done a good deed for a reptile." And this line struck me right away as funny, and I don't know to what degree this humor is there in the original. So in Foster's translation, the humor seems to come from the sudden use of precise technical terminology, referring to the snake as a reptile, which emphasizes the insignificance of the snake and hence the futility of Gilgamesh's quest and of all his efforts. And you can see in that a note of self-deprecation as well as frustration, right? And that's a perfect reversal of Gilgamesh's earlier boastfulness in the early parts of the narrative, where he's pounding his chest saying, "I'm the biggest, the strongest, the most beautiful." And I think that line, "I've done a good deed for a reptile," sounds almost like it could be from a Mel Brooks movie. And it struck me as strangely relatable, even familiar sounding. And perhaps this is my own projection, but it sounds to me very similar to many Jewish stories and parables, which emphasize human foibles and failed ambitions. And in a very similar way, at the end of last year, in December, I recounted and commented on a traditional story of two brothers who live on a mountainside in the Holy Land, in what's now Jerusalem, and they both try to give each other some of their grain, but their efforts cancel each other out. It's sort of, heartwarming, but also ironic. And as I explained, that story is often told in synagogues and mistakenly identified as a Jewish story from a midrash, when in fact it is a Palestinian folk story, first recorded in Jerusalem in the 1830s. And as I said, it's understandable that people can initially mistake that story for a Jewish story because it has a kind of Jewish feel to it. And so I would speculate that perhaps this ironic sensibility has deeper Middle Eastern roots, and that in the same sense as that Palestinian folk story, one could see the Epic of Gilgamesh as reflecting the same kind of ironic, detached, bemused view of human life, which may perhaps go all the way back into ancient times, and specifically to the ancient Near East. Okay, so those are some comments on the style and composition of the Gilgamesh cycle as a literary work. Now, how can we make sense of the meaning and significance of the story from the characters, the incidents, the settings, in the context of history and mythology? Well, to go back to the historical context, as I've said before, there is reason to think that there was a historical Gilgamesh who ruled in the city of Uruk somewhere around 2600 to 2700 BC. He has been listed as the fifth king of Uruk after the Great Flood, and he's associated with building and with the sun god Utu, later in Akkadian called Shamash. Now, beyond that, I would say there are significant grounds to suspect that the epic does refer to some real events. So the most significant of these, I think, is the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu's errand into the cedar forest. I think this is the most likely to reflect some actual historical event. So it was not unusual, as some scholars like N.K. Sandars have pointed out, it was not unusual in the Bronze Age for ancient cities to send expeditions and embassies to obtain scarce goods from faraway lands, prominently including cedar wood, which was very valuable and useful in building. And it would have been especially necessary in Sumer, which is a desert land with no timber and also no good source of stone, hence the heavy reliance on mud brick, which is even referred to in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that the walls are built of fired bricks. Wood has greater tensile strength, and it is needed to build large vaulted chambers, especially which can withstand earthquakes. And so it has sometimes been theorized that the forest into which Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey is in Lebanon or Syria, the sort of broad region which had great forests with large cedar trees, which were used in many different civilizations in the ancient Near East, such as Canaan, Babylon, Assyria, and even as far away as Persia. Egyptians also used cedar from Lebanon and Syria for building and also for creating valuable objects like sarcophagi, and the resin was used in the process of mummification. And that's probably because cedar resin repels pests, and perhaps even at this early time in Egypt, cedar was associated with immortality. So the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh may represent very early evidence, the earliest textual evidence of this widespread demand for cedar wood. Now then, when we look at the figure of Humbaba, the sort of monstrous creature who guards the mountains and forests where Gilgamesh wants to harvest timber, this figure of Humbaba may be compared to demons or trolls. He's an ugly and fiery figure living in an underground lair. But it may also have a historical inspiration. So according to Enkidu, when he is warning Gilgamesh not to try to venture into the forest, Enkidu warns that, quote, Humbaba, his voice is the deluge, his speech is fire, and his breath is death. And he's later also associated with shaking of the earth. And Enkidu warns, quote, if you penetrate his forest, you are seized by the tremors. Now later, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu are actually journeying out towards the cedar forest, they make several stops, and Gilgamesh has dreams, a series of prophetic dreams. And the third one seems to be, at least from the surviving text, the most elaborate and vivid and the most catastrophic. And he says, quote, the dream that I had was in utter confusion. Heaven cried aloud while earth did rumble. The day grew still, darkness came forth. There was a flash of lightning, fire broke out. The flames flared up, death rained down, and the flashes of fire went out. Where it had fallen, turned into cinders. End quote. And then later, when they're actually on the mountain and they fight Humbaba, the narrative says, quote, at the heels of their feet the earth burst asunder. Black became the clouds of white, raining down on them death like a mist. So as others have noted, including N.K. Sandars in her 1960 edition to the epic, all of this can sound quite a lot like seismic activity, namely earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. And it happens that much of the Near East is in fact seismically active, but mainly just in the form of earthquakes. There is very little volcanism anywhere around the Near East. There are mainly long dormant volcanoes in Iran and Saudi Arabia, which either have not erupted for thousands of years or only occasionally have small lava flows. But apparently there used to be more volcanism in the earlier Holocene era, so in the years closer to the end of the last ice age, in what archaeologists would call the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic period. In other words, those thousands of years when agriculture was first invented and the earliest towns and cities began to form. And it seems that this volcanism, insofar as it can be traced, was concentrated largely in the region that is today called Harat ash-Sham, basically crossing the border from southern Syria through Jordan and into Saudi Arabia. Now, this is quite relevant if we suppose, as many have argued, that the cedar forest in the Gilgamesh story is in the Syria and Lebanon area. So this region of volcanic activity in Harat ash-Sham is basically on the way. It's roughly the area that Gilgamesh and Enkidu would have actually passed through if they had made an overland journey from Uruk on the lower Euphrates to Lebanon. And moreover, I found that the last known eruption in that area has been dated by scientists to circa 2670 BC. In other words, right in that range of time when historians suppose that Gilgamesh probably lived in the 2600s BC. So we might theorize that perhaps this expedition to obtain cedar wood might have been undertaken and then delayed or disrupted by a volcanic eruption. And this cataclysmic fight with Humbaba preserves in some way a memory of this eruption. Now further, the historicity of this cedar expedition is further bolstered by the fact that it is attested very early in early sources. So there is an ancient Sumerian poem, largely intact, titled Gilgamesh and Huwawa, which is unusually long for the ancient Sumerian narratives. And it describes the same basic story, more or less as it appears in the standard Babylonian recension of the epic. But in this older Sumerian version, Gilgamesh and Enkidu do not set out alone, but rather with a company of 50 men. And this is much more realistic, right? You wouldn't send the king of your city out into the wild with just a lone sidekick. There would probably be a company of fighters and scouts who would keep them safe and ensure the success of the mission. And also, this ancient Sumerian version of Gilgamesh and Huwawa has a further detail in that it seems that as they approach the mountain, Huwawa casts a spell, and the entire company, other than Enkidu, falls into a deep sleep or stupor. And this might perhaps reflect the effect of poison gases, which are often released in volcanic activity. So based on all of this, I would theorize that the villain Huwawa, or Humbaba, as he later comes to be called in Akkadian, may be the personification of a dangerous natural force, like the volcano. And in that light, we can look at another somewhat similar episode that comes just after it in the Gilgamesh narrative, and that is Gilgamesh fighting and slaying the Bull of Heaven. So this story also is attested very early in a Sumerian poem called Hero in Battle. And I didn't mention this last time in my first lecture because it's not often counted among the surviving Sumerian stories of Gilgamesh because it's so fragmentary. There are only small and ambiguous pieces of it that have been recovered. But nonetheless, it seems from these fragments that this story, Hero in Battle, was also broadly similar to the story that appears in the standard Babylonian recension of the narrative, where Ishtar sends the Bull of Heaven as vengeance against Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And the surviving pieces include the passage that reads, quote, "At Uruk the bull devoured the pasture and drank the water of the river in great slurps. With each slurp it used up 1 mile of the river, but its thirst was not satisfied. It devoured the pasture and stripped the land bare." End quote. And then later in the Standard Babylonian epic, we're told, quote, "When it reached the land of Uruk, it dried up the woods, the reed beds and marshes. Down it went to the river, lowered the level by 7 full cubits." End quote. And then subsequent to this, we're told that the stamping and snorting of the bull opens up fissures in the land. So, as others have noted, this sounds a lot like a drought, another natural disaster in which crops and trees are lost and water sources disappear. Now, that's fine as far as it goes, but you might ask, well, how does a king get rid of a drought? In the narrative, Enkidu and Gilgamesh together slay the bull. What would be the equivalent of that? Well, maybe there isn't an exact equivalent, but it's significant, I think, that Gilgamesh defeats the bull by stabbing it in the neck. And then subsequent to that, the two of them take out the heart of the bull and bring it to the temple of Shamash, the sun god, and present it to him as an offering. In other words, this story, this episode in the epic, ends with a sacrifice. And perhaps this reflects the practice of animal sacrifices to gods in order to bring rain and fertility, and even specifically to end droughts. So from all of this, I personally would draw certain conjectures. Firstly, as we've established pretty well, that Gilgamesh was a real person. And I would go further and speculate that perhaps Enkidu also was inspired by some real person, an ally or companion of the king Gilgamesh. And this storyline that we find in the epic may involve real events, such as an expedition to obtain building materials from a cedar forest, and a sacrifice that took place at the end of a severe drought. And it's also important to note here that a major theme of the Gilgamesh cycle is the hero's struggle with death and mortality. And another important early surviving Sumerian story involves the death and funeral of Gilgamesh, and as we know, an important central passage in the middle of the Gilgamesh cycle involves the death and elaborate memorialization of Enkidu. So I would argue then that very possibly the basic beginning germ of the Gilgamesh cycle, from which this entire elaborate work eventually sprouted, you could say, started off from the stories and odes that were composed and performed at the funeral of the actual historical Gilgamesh, which were then later expanded and embellished and then collected together into a narrative cycle. Okay, so let's say that's about all that we can conclude or confidently speculate about Gilgamesh in history based on what we know as of right now. Well, what about Gilgamesh in mythological context, alongside the known myths and legends of the ancient world, and even later, including the Bible, Egyptian mythology, Greek and Roman myths, etc.? Well, here, this can be a rich field for interpretation and comparisons, but it also presents a big problem. There's a sort of special dilemma that is unique to the Epic of Gilgamesh because it is the oldest known narrative in the world, in the sense of an extended story with cause and effect and characters, unlike just a chronicle that lists off dates and events. So the problem with the Epic of Gilgamesh is that you can only compare forward in time to later known events, stories, and rituals. There's nothing earlier against which to compare it. And so you cannot do this sort of analysis on the Epic of Gilgamesh without anachronism. You have to try to interpret meanings and significance based on what came later. And similarities and connections may be totally phantasmic or projection, or even if they do exist, they may be distorting or misleading, because perhaps the meanings of figures, events, symbols changed dramatically over the centuries. And insofar as there are similarities and parallels, they might reflect the influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh on later mythic cycles and rituals. And it's tempting then to see Gilgamesh as a kind of ultimate ur-myth, the origin point of all myths and epic stories, but we really don't know that that's true. It clearly wasn't the beginning of all storytelling, right? There already was complex mythology and folklore before this. It's just much harder to reconstruct. We have to do it conjecturally from later stories that have survived. And different stories insofar as they show similarities that might stem from shared roots in some wider and older body of myths that we cannot encounter so directly, and this gives everything an even greater ambiguity. But with all of those caveats, what are these parallels that we can see? Firstly, to biblical myth. Well, as we know, for the Victorians, this was their great preoccupation, and it presented them with a dangerous double-edged sword. On the one hand, you could see similarities between the Gilgamesh narrative and the biblical text as proof of the accuracy of the Bible. This bolstered its credibility as a literal source of historical fact. But on the other hand, you could see instead these similarities to Gilgamesh as proof of outside influence, because the epic is older than the oldest texts in the Bible, and hence it could at the same time threaten to expose the Bible as a product of cribbing or mimicry of pagan sources. But as perhaps a lot of you are already thinking, we don't necessarily have to see this either way. We can also look at the Epic of Gilgamesh as in some way a cousin of the Bible, coming out of this complex evolving matrix of Near Eastern folklore and myth, and we don't necessarily have to say that it is a source or a proof text of the Bible. So these examples come mostly from the book of Genesis, and one important parallel comes out right in the opening description of the city of Uruk, right at the beginning of that first tablet of the Gilgamesh cycle. And that, first and foremost, is the importance of building. So we're told right away that Uruk has enormous high walls and a large temple in an enclosed sanctuary, which is very evocative of important building episodes in the Bible. For one thing, the Tower of Babel, which is described in Genesis 11. This is built in the midst of a great city called Babel, which is clearly inspired, at least in part, by Babylon in Mesopotamia. The people of this city are said to have built a tower so high that God confused their tongues so that the building project would stop and the tower would be left unfinished. And this is significant, for one thing, because it is the only episode recorded in the Bible in the entire time range between the Great Flood on the one hand and the appearance of Abraham and the tribe of Jews on the other hand. So hence, as of the mid-1800s, that was really all the history that people knew of that entire era of several millennia, apart from some scant inscriptions from ancient Egypt. So naturally, people saw a connection here between this Babel episode and what they saw in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And specifically, if one looks into Genesis 10, which is the chapter just before the Babel episode, this chapter describes how the earth was divvied up among the different descendants of Noah. So right in the aftermath of the Great Flood. And it specifically names Uruk and Babylon. So there's a section that's clearly talking about Mesopotamia. And it names Nimrod as a great-grandson of Noah who ruled over Uruk, Akkad, and Babylon, all of which, as we know, are in Mesopotamia. And the same passage also describes this ruler Nimrod as a mighty hunter. And Gilgamesh in the epic, as we know, is described as slaying great animals like bulls and lions. So from very early on, people identified Gilgamesh with Nimrod, basically supposing that these were just two different names for the same person, the same figure. Nonetheless, I would say they're probably not the same person. More likely, there was a long-standing association, especially in Mesopotamia, of kingship with both building and hunting. So these are two arts associated with kings, one an art of civilization and the city, and the other an art of survival and prowess in the wild. So they're sort of opposites in this way. One is a power that enables rulers and cities to reach upward towards the heavens. The other is an art by which the ruler extends power outward into the landscape and into the unknown. So these two things are connected in the Bible, right? Especially around the city of Babylon, which is said to be ruled by Nimrod, and it's the site of the Tower of Babel. And likewise, they're also connected in the person and story of Gilgamesh. And further on this same sort of theme, there is this need for cedars in order to raise a great temple. And cedar wood is associated in the Epic of Gilgamesh with the great temple called Eanna, dedicated to Ishtar in the city of Uruk. And this can be seen to echo and evoke, specifically in the Bible, King Solomon's acquisition of cedars from Lebanon in order to build the temple at Jerusalem. And Solomon in the Bible is presented as the paragon of wisdom, much like Gilgamesh, at least in the standard Babylonian recension. He's said to be wise, all-knowing. He is the man who saw the deep. This is what first distinguishes him. And so hence you see building here associated with, and I think serving as a metaphor for wise rule and the assurance of order and harmony in the world. Okay, so we can see all of that just in Tablet 1, and then further there's the creation of the other hero, the second hero, Enkidu. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Aruru, the goddess, models Enkidu from clay and sets him down on earth where he comes to life. And this can be seen to encapsulate together the stories in Genesis of the creation of both Adam and Eve. So Adam is fashioned from clay and then is ensouled and brought to life. And then Eve is made by taking a rib from Adam and fashioning it into a woman to be a companion to Adam, so he is not alone. Well, in the case of Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu is created in order to be the companion and equal to Gilgamesh, who prior to this has no spouse or partner that we hear of. So you could see this as an odd sort of same-sex echo of the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis. Then as we follow Enkidu, there is his taming, you could say. So initially he's said to live freely among the animals, naked like one of them. But then he changes with his first exposure to a woman and to sex. And the sexual part is made very explicit in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it's left more implicit in Genesis. But after having sex with Shamhat, the temple priestess, Enkidu for the first time puts on clothing. Shamhat is said to divide her robe in two and use half of it to wrap and clothe Enkidu. And then he is also, in a sense, you could say, cast out of the garden, right? So if we compare Enkidu's life among the wild animals to the life of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, this is a sort of primitive, you could say, paradisal existence that then is disrupted. So after Enkidu has engaged in sex with Shamhat, then we're told that the animals turn away from him, and he is sort of frozen out of what had been this primitive paradise, and subsequently he decides to go to the city and join civilization. He also, you could see a deep sort of symbolic transformation going on here, where Enkidu becomes aware of differences and distinctions between male and female, between naked and clothed, between human and animal, and between nature and civilization, in much the same way that Adam and Eve also must take on clothes, they must accept mortality, they have to labor. In all sorts of ways, this sort of primitive natural world is being divided and in this way ordered and civilized. Now, the description of animals turning away and running away from Enkidu can also be seen as reminiscent of the story of Noah, which comes a few chapters later in Genesis. So Noah, as you know, survives the flood on his great ark and then lands as the floodwaters are receding. And God makes a series of pronouncements to Noah. And for one thing, he tells Noah that henceforth the animals will be afraid of him. And the text has God saying, quote, "The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds of the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you." So this passage in Genesis 9 is, as we see, reminiscent of this episode with Enkidu in the Gilgamesh narrative. It also is quite reminiscent of an earlier point in Genesis 1, where God gives to Adam dominion over the creatures of the earth and the sea and the air, and even the wording is quite similar. So this points to a basic underlying understanding that the creation narrative and the flood narrative are parallel and in many ways echo one another. So the flood itself, whether we're talking about the Gilgamesh cycle or Genesis, the flood recreates the primordial chaos before the act of creation. And the ark and the survivors then recreate the experience of the first creation, and they get a sort of second chance to avoid the mistakes and the fate of Adam and Eve. And if we look specifically again into Gilgamesh, there is an understanding that the flood is a kind of rebirth or a second birth of humankind. And hence this very suggestive metaphor where the text says that the sea thrashed like a woman in childbirth. So I think there is this very important symbolic resonance here between the flood narrative in Gilgamesh and in the Bible. So this is the most extended parallel by far between the Gilgamesh narrative and the Hebrew Bible. So in both stories, we see that mankind in the antediluvian age before the flood, mankind has grown numerous, it is busy and industrious, it has built cities. According to the Bible, the city of Enoch, the first city, was created before the flood. Then God or the gods decide to wipe humankind out with a great flood. A forewarning is given to one particular patriarch, along with then plans and dimensions for a massive boat to survive the flood. This patriarch gathers his entire family, as well as many pairs of animals, to board the boat. The boat successfully stays afloat until the storm abates and the waters begin to recede. The people on the boat release out birds repeatedly for several days in order to ascertain whether there is dry land. And then after landing and emerging, they set up altars to make offerings to God or the gods. And then subsequently, God or the gods make promises to these survivors as if acting in recompense for creating this huge disaster and in order to encourage these human survivors to repopulate the earth. Now, of course, in the Bible, this is all the result of the will and decrees of a single God. And yet, nonetheless, there are strange parallels, even here, between the God we see in the Hebrew Bible and these ancient Mesopotamian gods in the Gilgamesh story. So in the Gilgamesh cycle, before the flood, the gods are in a state of disagreement. They're not all enthusiastic about wiping out humankind. The big instigator is Enlil. It's also, as we said, implied that Ishtar plays a role here. Meanwhile, Ea, the sea god, sneakily warns Utnapishtim about what is coming and enables him to build the boat to survive. After the flood is over, the gods are full of remorse and they blame Enlil. Now, if we look at the Hebrew Bible, the Israelite God seems to be in some sense ambivalent as well. Why would he will this massive disaster to wipe out humankind, but then also tell Noah what was coming and enable him to survive it? Perhaps he has misgivings. And then after the flood, even more significantly, God does not seem to entirely trust himself. Despite his omnipotence and omniscience, he is apparently afraid of his own failures of will or judgment or of memory. So God promises never to attack humankind again, and he sets up the rainbow as a reminder to himself not to repeat this disaster. So in Genesis 9, we're told that God gives various commandments to humankind, not to kill or to shed blood, and to be fruitful and multiply. And then in return, God says, quote, I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. So God says pretty explicitly here that he needs a reminder to stop himself in future. And this can seem awfully strange, right? If God is supposed to be omniscient, why is he worried that he's going to forget these promises and commitments he's made to humankind? Well, this incident has a strange parallel in the Gilgamesh story. So the goddess Ishtar is especially furious and ashamed at what the gods have done to the earth. And she points to the jewels that she is wearing on her person, and she says, "O gods, let these great beads in this necklace of mine make me remember these days and never forget them. All the gods shall come to the incense, but to the incense let Enlil not come, because he lacked counsel and brought on the deluge, and delivered my people into destruction." End quote. So Ishtar is similarly setting up this necklace, whatever that might be, as a reminder and a marker, much as God in the Hebrew Bible uses the rainbow. And I would speculate that perhaps this necklace Ishtar is wearing perhaps also is understood to be the rainbow. Maybe that is how ancient Sumerians or Babylonians understood the rainbow, as a jewel adorning a goddess. So it may actually be the same specific image they're talking about here. But in this case, they are a reminder for this disaster, these days, and also a marker that Enlil is now specially excluded from these offerings of humankind. The loss of humankind would have meant the loss of incense, right, of these offerings to the gods. And because Enlil, in her view, was the instigator who tried to destroy humanity, he is not entitled to that privilege. So there's a lot of parallel here, and you can even see Ishtar's declaration that Enlil should be banished from the offerings to the gods as similar to God promising never to make another flood. The obvious differences are that we're talking here about multiple gods, and that their reason is petty. Right? As far as we can tell from other Babylonian texts, it seems that the reason for the flood was that humans were making too much noise, whereas in the Bible the reason is their sinfulness. And this is still non-specific. We don't know what sort of sins God was concerned about, but nonetheless the tale is sort of moralized. But in a lot of ways, even the theology is quite similar. So God in Genesis is understood to be singular, at least on one level. But if we look deeper, he has this strange, complex personality. He is fickle and mysterious, much like the assembly of the Babylonian gods. And the word that is often used to refer to God repeatedly in Genesis is Elohim, which originally at root is a plural word, the gods. So there's really not even that much theological difference here, right? And we can see, if we look at this in context, it seems as if the ancient Israelite story has been reassigned to a single deity representing a single unified tribe, and perhaps by extension a single unified humankind, or even a single unified earthly creation, right? Because God says in this story that he's making a covenant with all the living creatures on earth, right? So hence, the God has been united into one entity, one deity, to reflect that sort of overarching unity of creation. But nonetheless, the conflict seems to remain, right? The fickleness, the unpredictability, the ambivalence is still there. It's just been moved into a sort of invisible space, right, behind a veil of mystery, but it is not gone. And this illustrates, I think, how stories and ideas can shift quite easily among different theological positions: polytheism, henotheism, devotion to one God, and monotheism. But all of these positions are unstable and can easily slide into one another. And stories often with very similar significance can just sort of move from one umbrella to another while retaining a lot of the same meanings. And also it's important that the conclusion of the biblical story of the flood is this reciprocal covenant between God and living creatures. So there's a sort of mutuality between God and his creation. And this also, I think, is similar to the Gilgamesh story, right? So part of why the gods are so distraught and regretful is that they're going hungry, without offerings and sacrifices from humans. And once there is a sacrificial offering, they swarm upon it like flies, as if they've been starving. And this too underscores a sense of mutual dependence between humans and the divine. You could even say human belief and worship sustains the existence of the gods. And this can shed light then on the biblical story, right? So all throughout the Bible, you could ask, why does God care so much about humanity? Why does, if he is perfect and eternal, why does he not just ignore petty human affairs? Well, you could say it's because human beings are God's creatures made in his image, and they must exist in order for him to exist. They mutually sustain one another. Okay, so let's say we briefly revisit this question of origins. Did the biblical narrative come from Gilgamesh? I think that there are so many points of comparison that it's likely that there is carryover. There is some ancestral connection back to the Gilgamesh narrative. But it's probably not very direct. It doesn't look as if anybody was copying. There is no identical wording. And that would have been an enormous bombshell if someone had found an actual line or even just a phrase from the Gilgamesh series that's exactly reproduced in Genesis. There is no such match. But does it perhaps come from some common original? This seems more likely. And part of why I would say that there's probably some shared ancestor here that goes back even further, is that the flood narrative in Gilgamesh stands apart. It's a sort of distinct story within a story, or an extended flashback, and it has a sort of integrity, a beginning and middle and end unto itself that you can take out even of the context of Gilgamesh. So probably this story existed on its own, circulating separately, and then was inserted and incorporated into the Gilgamesh cycle. So we can imagine before this recension in Standard Babylonian, there probably was some older pre-existing Mesopotamian flood narrative, and it probably existed in many different versions, but the basic core story of the flood and the ark, the birds, this was most likely very ancient, probably already there, maybe even before the life of Gilgamesh, because that's what the cycle says. The cycle says that Gilgamesh was generations later, after the flood. So maybe that story was already going around even before the real Gilgamesh lived and died. And I would say finally that this raises again a possibility that I think has long been put aside but is worth taking up again, is maybe there was a great flood. Maybe a lot of this story was inspired by things that really happened. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers can flood if there's enough heavy rainfall, and it's a desert, right? Most of Mesopotamia has been a desert for a very long time, for thousands of years, but it probably was a bit wetter. And even in deserts, there can occasionally be enormous rainstorms, or as some people have argued, maybe this whole flood story even goes back to the glacial meltwater at the end of the last ice age, and perhaps also the rising seas that came with that massive glacial melt about 11 to 12,000 years ago. I don't think we can rule it out. Okay, so let's say we leave the flood story there for now. There is then later, after Gilgamesh reaches the island of Utnapishtim, learns about the flood, then turns back and lands again on the mainland, he brings with him this herb, an herb of immortality, which he obtained from the bottom of the sea. And as we know, he goes ashore, he bathes in a pool, and the herb is stolen by a snake. So the snake or serpent is clearly a significant symbol here. And it's reminiscent of the snake in the Garden of Eden in Genesis. So both of these snakes are smart, they're clever tricksters, and in some way they rob the hero of the chance of immortality. Gilgamesh in the ancient cycle, and Adam in the book of Genesis. And furthermore, even the setting of the incident is similar. So the garden in the Gilgamesh cycle is paradisal and eternal. As we saw, it has these sort of heavenly trees and bushes that grow jewels instead of fruit. It's also impossibly remote, difficult to access, apparently far off to the east, sort of at the edge of the world, much like Eden is described in the Bible as a place far to the east. However, the story works differently. So in Gilgamesh, the snake steals away the herb that offers immortality, or at least the restoration of youth. Whereas in Genesis, the snake induces humans to eat a fruit that will then make them mortal. So it's a sort of opposite mechanism. But nonetheless, the difference in the structure of the two stories points then, I think, to a deeper common symbolism of the snake itself, as most likely representing the desire for and allure of immortality. And this probably is because snakes have no limbs. Their bodies are just continuous bands, and so they can be seen to represent unbroken continuity. And the image, for instance, the image of the snake biting its own tail and forming a loop, has been used repeatedly from ancient times all the way to today to represent eternity, or eternally recurring cycles of time. And the Greek deity Asclepius, the founder of medicine, is depicted holding a staff with a snake wound around it, representing immortality, and Asclepius was said to be able to raise the dead. Snakes are also low, quiet, and stealthy, and can easily camouflage themselves before striking, and so they can represent both the elusiveness of immortality and the sinister stealthiness of death, which can arrive without warning. Now, this same incident in Gilgamesh, where his herb that he retrieved from the sea is stolen away while he's bathing in a pool, this reflects also the repeating importance of bathing, which comes into the Gilgamesh story over and over again. So Enkidu bathes when he first becomes, you could say, a civilized human with Shamhat. Then when Enkidu and Gilgamesh return from the forest after killing Humbaba, they bathe in the river, which is what attracts the attention of Ishtar. Then later, when Gilgamesh finally accepts his mortality on Utnapishtim's island and prepares to go back, he's bathed and anointed. And then again, as we said, when he gets ashore, he bathes in a pool where he loses the herb of immortality. So over and over again, bathing relates to changes and transformations in the characters and their mentalities. And it doesn't have a straightforward, consistent meaning, but it possibly represents the embrace of one's humanity, right? Bathing, you take care of your body. You present your body as a sort of holy object, and perhaps it represents the sort of embrace of human existence. So in the story, it seems to perhaps represent the giving up of delusions and the cleansing away of the sort of baser ill effects of human life. So the cleansing away of blood from violent acts and also dirt from long journeys. Perhaps the story in this way might have provided an origin myth for ancient Mesopotamian practices of ritual bathing. And I would argue that this may be the precursor for the practice of the mikveh, ritual bathing in Judaism, which is understood to be cleansing and customary on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, I think, also is connected to what we see in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And by extension, this importance and symbolism of bathing probably relates by extension also to baptism, right? The Christian adaptation of the mikveh, basically, where it's understood to wash away sin. And specifically, if we think of that sort of transitional moment just before the emergence of Christianity proper, which is the John the Baptist movement, we're told in the Bible that John the Baptist went out into the desert, baptizing people in the Jordan River. And Gilgamesh can be seen to prefigure this and presage even the figure of John the Baptist, wherein in the later part of the story, he goes out wandering into the desert wearing plain animal skins, which is the same way John the Baptist is traditionally depicted, and goes out in search of eternal life, which he does not find, but which arguably John the Baptist does find in the figure of Christ. Okay, now lastly, as far as Jewish and Christian mythology goes, I already hinted, there is, I think, a prefiguring of the idea of the Sabbath. So as I pointed out earlier, in the Gilgamesh cycle, there are repeating periods and cycles of 6 days and 7 nights. And it's interesting, the sort of imbalance that we're told about this stretch of time, which leaves off one day, right? After the seventh night, the seventh day doesn't count as part of this standard repeating cycle of time. It seems it's set apart as different. For example, in the flood narrative, we're told that the rain falls for 6 days and 7 nights. And then on the seventh day, the text says, quote, "But when the seventh day came, the gale relented, the deluge ended. The ocean grew calm that had thrashed like a woman in labor. The tempest grew still, the deluge ended." So I think that this repeating cycle of time may have started initially as just a narrative device, right? Just a byword for saying that something happens for an extended period before it then finally comes to a conclusion and the story then moves on. It could serve as a sort of narrative code, much like, 40 days and 40 nights is used many times in the Bible. But then it became part of the sort of ordering of cycles of time and the sense of repetition and recurrence in accord with the repetition of the seasons and the movements of the stars and the heavenly bodies. So I think that probably this notion took root that a period of 6 days followed by a seventh day represents something, and that the seventh day is special. It's somehow a pause, an ending. It is set apart as sort of taboo or forbidden. And then this then came to be sanctified in Jewish practice in the form of the 6 days of the ordinary week, followed by the seventh day when work ceases, and it is set apart as different, and there are taboos around that seventh day. And this is very similar to what happened with the calendar, right? So the Hebrew calendar, which is used to calculate the holy days in the Jewish ritual cycle, this is adopted very closely from the Babylonian lunisolar calendar, which was developed in ancient Mesopotamia mainly for astrology and prognostication. Right? So what may have begun as just a simple way to calculate the cycles of time, then in Judaism becomes something sacred. So in this way, you could say the epic helps to place ancient Hebrew myths and rituals into a deeper and older Near Eastern context. But this then leaves the further question, do the stories and symbols in Gilgamesh have a broader or deeper meaning even beyond the ancient Near East and biblical mythology? So arguably, there are even more parallels and resonances between episodes in the Gilgamesh cycle and myths and legends and epics from the Mediterranean world and Europe, even more than with the early Hebrew Bible like Genesis. So if we start again with the journey into the forest, which I argued might be the most likely to reflect some real historical event, at the same time, when we look at that in conjunction with the figure of Humbaba, the sort of monstrous creature who lives in a quasi-underground lair and guards the forest, this is echoed, for one thing, you might think of in Beowulf, where Grendel ventures out into this sort of swampy land and attacks and personally slays this monster Grendel, who lives also in a sort of underground cave lair. And there are even remarkably similar scenes that are evocative of Gilgamesh in other more obscure medieval tales and romances. For instance, N.K. Sandars points out the close parallel with the Welsh cycle, the Mabinogion, in which we're told of a hero, Cynon, who goes out into the forest, which is guarded by a sort of monstrous herdsman who can hear and sense and control the activities of animals, much like Humbaba in the epic is said to hear everything that happens and all the movements of the animals throughout the forest. And even the description of the view of the forest as one enters is very close. In both cases, the heroes see a wide, well-trodden path beside a stream leading to an exceptionally tall and verdant cedar tree, and then past that up a mountainside to where the monstrous figure's lair is located. So it's almost like they're talking about the same place, right? A forest that may have originally been in Lebanon or Syria now seems to somehow reappear as far away as Wales. Then following their defeat of Humbaba, there is then the contention with a goddess and the rejection of her overtures and resistance to her wiles. So Gilgamesh, as we saw, rejects Ishtar, and further he lists off past lovers that she has destroyed, in some cases by turning them into animals. such as the shepherd that she transformed into a wolf. So she seems to relate to the figure that I've talked about before in other lectures of the sort of mistress of animals and goddess of the hunt, who takes different forms as Artemis or Diana, or later in the medieval era as Herodias or Herodiana, and whose devotees often are also transformed into animal forms. And in the Odyssey, we see similarly sort of seductive but dangerous female figures like the Sirens and Calypso, who try to capture Odysseus and his men. Most of all, we see the similarity in Circe, who, in addition to attempting to seduce Odysseus, she also has this power of animal transformation and turns most of Odysseus's men into pigs. And this might perhaps be a representation of how sexual instinct reduces men into beasts or into their bestial form. But then ironically, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you also have this sort of strange reversal where Enkidu is animalistic at the beginning of his story, and he is in a sense civilized and humanized by sex. So perhaps Ishtar and the priestess Shamhat represent sort of opposite faces of this female power and sexual power. Then, as we know, they slay the bull of heaven, whom Ishtar sends to wreak vengeance on Gilgamesh and his city. And this is, again, like many heroic stories, especially from the Greek-speaking world. You can think of Theseus and the Minotaur, right? Theseus, the hero, ventures into the center of the labyrinth, is able to overwhelm and kill this sort of half-bull, half-human figure of the Minotaur. And then also later, during the Roman era, we see this cult of Mithras emerge out of the Near East and spread through the Roman Empire. And we don't know a lot about their beliefs, but we know that their meeting places had ceremonial sculptures showing their hero Mithras slaying a bull. This scene is called the tauroctony. And moreover, he's seen slaying the bull in similar fashion by stabbing it in the neck. And also in the sculpture, we see other figures arranged in a sort of clearly symbolic configuration. One is a snake that is lapping blood from the bull's wound, perhaps representing the stealing of life, like the snake in Gilgamesh who steals the herb of life. There's also customarily a scorpion seen stinging the testicles of the bull, which perhaps represents the stealing or neutering of reproductive power or sexuality. And some have theorized that the tauroctony has a zodiacal symbolism. So the bull may represent the constellation Taurus or vice versa, and then the scorpion would be Scorpio. And it happens that Taurus and Scorpio are opposite one another in the zodiac, which was originally developed in Babylon, in Mesopotamia. So perhaps the scorpion stinging the bull represents something about the rising of Scorpio at the same time that Taurus is setting, because they're opposite one another in the sky. And this is enough to suggest possible Babylonian roots to the Mithras cult, which, as I said, seems to have spread into the Roman Empire from the east. And also it suggests a possible link to Gilgamesh. So there are reasons to suppose that at least the Babylonians related the Gilgamesh narrative to the zodiac and the cycle of the seasons, right? And that's very likely, I think, why it's on 12 tablets. And moreover, that the final tablet seems to have kind of been tacked on to round out that set of 12. So in this case, we could relate the constellation Taurus to the bull of heaven, which appears in the storyline. And also we can see a contrast here between the bull, who is a genuine threat and menace to Uruk, and on the other hand, the scorpion figures, who do show up then later in the Gilgamesh story. And in this case, they're huge and presumably frightening and fearsome. They're guarding over the passageway where the sun rises and sets. But they're surprisingly friendly and benign, and after giving a sort of caution, they actually help and guide Gilgamesh on his way. So again, we see a possible opposition here between the bull and the scorpion, corresponding to their positions in the zodiac. So having noticed these things, it's tempting, of course, to look at other figures in the story as somehow also zodiacal. Gilgamesh slays lions, perhaps that relates to Leo. And then, of course, the central figures of Enkidu and Gilgamesh themselves, who are often described embracing, holding hands. Perhaps they relate to Gemini, which appears in the ecliptic right next to Taurus the bull. Now, all of that being said, the incident in the story continues. After the bull has been killed, then Enkidu reportedly takes one of the legs and throws it back at Ishtar. And some have argued that this is perhaps a euphemism for the genitals. And it does seem that in a lot of ancient and classical literature, references to the leg or the thigh are actually indirect euphemisms for the reproductive organs. So perhaps this part of the story recalls the castration of animals as part of regular agricultural life or as a ritual and a sacrificial offering. And also it seems to possibly recall castration of people as a part of other Near Eastern mystery cults, such as the cult of Cybele, which likewise, like the cult of Mithras, spread from Anatolia westward into the Roman Empire, became somewhat popular in the later Roman Empire, and centers on a fearsome goddess of sex and fertility, basically similar to Ishtar, they've often been identified, and whose devotees often did castrate themselves as part of their devotion and commitment to this cult. So one might suppose if castration was also associated with Ishtar, as it later was with Cybele, then perhaps the throwing of the thigh is a mockery and a rejection of this extreme cult of fertility. Then ultimately, as we mentioned before, the two heroes take out the heart of the bull and offer it as a sacrifice to the sun god Shamash. And this seems to be echoed in the story of the Cretan bull. So this is a monstrous bull who is said to be the father of the Minotaur. It's a rampaging beast which terrorized both Crete and the mainland of Greece, and is also believed to have been slaughtered by Theseus, like its offspring, the Minotaur. And then Theseus offered this giant bull as a sacrifice, and in some versions of the story, specifically to the sun god Apollo. So we're seeing the same sort of narrative playing out again. Then that is followed, as we know, by the death of Enkidu by decree of the gods and Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu. And we can see in this story there's a lot of irony here in that Gilgamesh is arguably responsible for the events leading up to Enkidu's death. He insisted on going on the forest expedition, which Enkidu had warned against, and he also rudely refused Ishtar's advances, leading eventually to the battle with the bull. And after Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh is said to hang on to his loved one's body, refusing to give it up for 6 days until it was visibly decaying. Now, some of you may find this a little familiar if you've read the Iliad by Homer, in which we have the figures of Achilles and Patroclus. Patroclus dies in the Trojan War, largely because of Achilles' refusal to fight in that war, which then left Patroclus to sort of lead the charge in his stead. And then after Patroclus is killed, Achilles goes into deep grief and holds on to his lover's body for several days, refusing to give it up for burial until he can avenge his death. There's also the broader story, basically, of the whole later part of the Gilgamesh cycle, which is this journey into a faraway land in search of immortality, much like many mysterious distant lands in European legends like Avalon in the Arthurian cycle, the Elysian Fields, the Isles of the Blessed, and all of them can be seen in different ways to resemble Shiduri's garden. So if you think of Shiduri, who keeps the inn, who welcomes travelers from far away and serves them beer, which may be also some sort of magical elixir. It's much like the Isle of Avalon, or the Isles of the Blessed, where you have these imagined sort of immortal women living in this sort of mystical otherworld where they receive fallen men. These places can also be seen in different ways as resembling Utnapishtim's island, right, where Gilgamesh ultimately locates the immortal man and woman. The island could be compared, for one thing, to Hades, the portrayal of the underworld in Greek myth, which is separated from the world of the living by a waterway, which can only be crossed with the help of a sort of divine boatman, in the same way that Gilgamesh gets across this sort of sea of the dead with the help of Urshanabi on his boat. And this culminates then with this final attempt to find a source of immortality under the water of the dead, which resonates with stories for the search for the fountain of youth or the alchemical elixir of life. And specifically, I would say if you look in the Alexander romance, this is a long-running, long-evolving narrative, a sort of fantastical version of the career of Alexander the Great. And it seems it was written first in Greek, although there's no complete Greek original that's been found, and then it was translated and elaborated further in other languages, most especially in Syriac. And the Syriac version gives the most elaborate account of reaching a sort of land of the blessed. So basically, the core narrative says that Alexander, when he's away on his expeditions in the east, he has his cook, Andreas, catch some fish to eat. He catches some from the sea and kills them, and then cleans them by dipping them in a spring, at which moment they then suddenly spring back to life and swim away. So Andreas realizes that this spring is the water of immortality, which was rumored to exist somewhere to the east. And he keeps this knowledge secret. He drinks some of the water for himself and then saves some more in a vessel in order to bribe the princess, the daughter of Alexander, to marry him. Alexander eventually finds out about this, and he punishes both Andreas and his daughter by separating them and turning Andreas into a sea demon and his daughter into a water demon. And this episode is further elaborated in the Syriac version. Here, Alexander does find out sooner about the water of life and tries to capture its power for himself, but gives up. And it seems that this tale is then later alluded to in the Quran. So you can see various similarities here of a powerful, conquering hero traveling to a faraway land, in this case accidentally finding the waters that give immortality, as opposed to Gilgamesh searching and finding the herb of immortality. Andreas catches the fish from the sea and goes to wash them in a freshwater spring, much like Gilgamesh, after retrieving the herb from under the sea, goes ashore and washes his body in the spring. And there seems to be a sense here that the sea represents death while fresh water represents life. And lastly, the fish slip away a lot like the snake, stealing the herb and slithering away with it. And then finally, I would say we have this Tablet 12 story of Enkidu in the Netherworld. So this appears, as I said, on Tablet 12 of the Standard Babylonian Recension found in Nineveh. It was probably not included in the cycle by the earlier editor Shinleku Unini in the 1000s BC, but was more likely added on by scribes and scholars at Nineveh. Why? Well, probably to round out the complete number of 12, and also because of its thematic importance and its usefulness as a myth explaining why Gilgamesh knows about life and death. So in this story, Enkidu travels into the underworld in order to retrieve lost possessions that Gilgamesh has lost there. He's given rules of conduct of how to behave in the underworld, and he breaks them, and he ends up trapped there. And you can see this as very reminiscent of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, in which Orpheus breaks the command not to turn and look back at his wife when he is leading her back from the underworld to earth, and so she is lost and trapped in the underworld forever. And incidentally, how did Eurydice end up there in the first place? Well, she died because of a snake bite. There's also the story of Persephone, who is abducted and taken down into the underworld by Hades. She wants to go back to the world of the living, but she ends up having to remain at least part of the year in the underworld because she ate a part of a pomegranate. So she sort of incorporated the world of the dead into herself and hence is trapped there. And then in the second part of this tale, at the end of the Gilgamesh cycle, the spirit of Enkidu is allowed to rise up through a crevice in the earth as a sort of shade and deliver a report to Gilgamesh, much as Utnapishtim is said to give a report of the flood to Gilgamesh, so Enkidu gives an account of what he sees in the underworld. And this is much like an episode, for one thing, in the Odyssey, in which Odysseus goes to a sort of misty, distant land, the land of the Cimmerians, which is near the entranceway to the underworld. He digs a trench in the ground, pours in wine and ram's blood and other rich offerings, and then shades emerge out of the trench, including Tiresias, the blind prophet, and Agamemnon, the fallen hero, and his mother. So the raising of Agamemnon, who is also a great, formidable warrior who has fallen and died, him being risen from the dead, he's the last one to speak to Odysseus, his old comrade. That can be seen as very similar to the scene of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And then Tiresias, the blind prophet, I think also connects this story to another, which probably was written down a bit later in the 6th century BC, which is an incident in the first book of Samuel, in what's now part of the Hebrew Bible. So this is a Jewish story, but it does come from a bit later than the book of Genesis. It comes from a period when there was a lot of contact with Persia and Greece, and there may have been influences moving around. So this is an incident in the first book of Samuel concerning the witch of Endor. So in this incident, King Saul, the first king of the Israelites, is afraid about going into battle against the Philistines. He wants advice and prophecy from the prophet Samuel, who had previously anointed Saul as king. The problem is that Samuel is dead. So Saul goes to a witch, simply called the Witch of Endor, who conjures up shades out of the earth, one of which turns out to be Samuel, and this specter or spirit of Samuel gives him very grim predictions that he's going to lose to the Philistines. And specifically in this passage, the witch is said to have an ob, which is understood to possibly mean a pit used for summoning up the dead out of the earth, much like the Akkadian Abu. They seem to be referring to the same thing, and again, they're related languages. And this ob is said to be at a place called Endor, and the meaning of that word seems to be around well or spring, which is perhaps evocative of the spring pool, for instance, where Gilgamesh loses the herb of immortality. So we see here repeating appearances of the shades of the dead being conjured up from openings in the earth and delivering prophecies and reports from an afterlife. So, say we pause there. This leaves the question then of why are there all these parallels and similarities of different figures and incidents in the Gilgamesh epic and these other stories that come from the West, whether Judea or Greece or even other parts further west in Europe? Well, there are several possibilities here. One is that Greek and Roman and Jewish authors in the 800s to 500s BC actually read Gilgamesh. Now, this is a controversial idea, and for one thing, I would say there don't seem to be any exact matches in wording between the texts of the different versions of the Gilgamesh cycle and these other later myths and stories that I've talked about. There are only similarities in the outlines of events and incidents. And further, as others have pointed out, if somehow somebody did get a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh all the way to Greece or wherever, nobody there could read cuneiform. Somebody would have had to go through the laborious work of translation. It's not likely. A second explanation is that there was a tradition and network of oral transmission extending all the way from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, through which Gilgamesh stories could reach to the West and influence later stories and texts there through the centuries. And this seems somewhat more likely. For instance, when it comes to the Iliad, some have argued for direct borrowing, but more likely it was somehow influenced, with different figures and stories being borrowed and repeated for what they were understood to represent. Right? So say that the holding on to the body of the dead fallen comrade characterizes the type of relationship you're talking about. A third possibility is that there are common, even more ancient roots, like we theorized regarding the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Genesis narrative. So this seems like a more likely explanation of similarities with stories like the Cretan bull and his offspring, the Minotaur. So if we look at that example, those are stories taking place in Crete. And the island of Crete was home to a very ancient Minoan civilization of the Bronze Age, basically contemporary with the heyday of Babylon. And the Minoans on Crete produced art centering on bull figures dating to the 1400s BC, almost contemporary, in that case, with the Hittite recension of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the Hittites, it happens, were based in Anatolia and formed a link from the Minoans and the Mediterranean world to Asia. So these stories, like Minotaur and the Cretan Bull, may represent the memory in Greece of beliefs and rituals around bulls that had been shared among civilizations in the Bronze Age world, and which I would argue were most likely rooted in bull sacrifices. So as I've said before in other lectures about other topics, very often it seems that rituals come first. They're performed for some sort of social or magical or devotional purpose, and then myths are retroactively created in order to explain them. So shared practices like around bull sacrifices might explain these similarities in the stories. And in the same vein, you can see close resonances among the stories of the raising of the shade of Enkidu and Gilgamesh, of Tiresias and Agamemnon in the Odyssey, and Samuel in the Hebrew Bible, and these probably reflect similar widespread practices. And it should not be surprising, I think, that practices like the conjuring of the dead should be widely shared and similar across this broad area, because really magic, conjuring, and prophecy deal with contact with the strange and the otherworldly, and they're very often associated with the foreign, with exotic languages and symbols. You can think of, even today, people performing magic, say nonsense words or foreign words like hocus pocus, or invocations of weird Egyptian or Celtic gods, right? This is the sort of thing that travels because of its exoticism. Okay, now finally, there's a fourth explanation one can advance, which is that these recurring motifs in these different stories reflect archetypes, or figures symbolizing psychological forces that are widely shared among humankind and are sort of part of the human unconscious. So in this view, the story of Gilgamesh is essentially one of psychological change. And this became the main way of interpreting myths in general in about the mid-20th century. And you may know it was promoted by Carl Jung and his followers. You can think I mentioned Carl Jung in my lecture on UFOs. One of his last works was a book interpreting UFOs as a sort of psychological mythic symbol. And this framework came to be applied to the Gilgamesh epic basically right after it was translated into German and English in the 20th century. Okay, so Jung's very basic idea that he developed in the 1910s and 20s, to put it very simply, very crudely, is that the aim of psychiatry is to guide the process of personal psychological development, or what he called individuation. In other words, the creation of a whole integrated self, which stands apart from simply social convention. So, whereas one might begin early in life with a persona, a sort of constructed self that conforms to social expectations, individuation involves then a series of steps of development. Firstly, confrontation and integration with the shadow, meaning the side of oneself that one denies or hides from society, and which he believed was often represented in dreams or visions by an archetype, a sort of symbolic figure, which may be strange or frightening, but which one learns to see as simply the other side of one's own personality. Then after that, one goes through a similar process with another figure called an animus or anima. And this is a figure of the opposite gender, which represents the masculine side for a woman or the feminine side of a man. And Jungians customarily hold this process of meeting and merging with the animus to be an even greater challenge than merging with the shadow. It's kind of the ultimate challenge. So later in the 1940s, followers of Jung began to interpret mythology according to this same sort of scheme, seeing myths as a sort of analog or allegory for psychological individuation. And probably most famously, in 1949, Joseph Campbell published The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which argues that all myths and epics follow a similar form called the hero's journey. And he draws on examples like Moses, Odysseus, Sir Gawain, all of these kind of classic narrative heroes, and argues that you see a basic three-part story. Firstly, departure, where the hero sets out to find a way to save his community. And usually he is called to this quest, resists for some time, but then is induced or persuaded to go. Then an initiation stage in which he overcomes challenges, fights opponents, chooses a light path and good mentor, you could say a sort of light father figure, over an evil or dark father figure. He resists temptations by a female figure, discovers his true parentage in many cases, which can be seen to represent discovering one's true nature. And then the return phase, in which he achieves some boon like a magic object or knowledge, then for a time cannot or does not want to go back home, and must be forced to come back or rescued. And he then returns home to share this boon with the community, but keeps a foot in some way in both worlds. Still has this sort of new knowledge and self-knowledge that came from the journey to the other world. And this can be taken to symbolize psychological maturity and balance. So starting around this same time in the late 40s, in a kind of dialectical move, many Jungians began to analyze other myths as further instances of this hero's journey, and hence as psychological allegories. And in 1948, just the year before Joseph Campbell published Hero with a Thousand Faces, a doctoral student named Rivkah Scharf presented a dissertation analyzing the figure of Satan in the Old Testament. And Carl Jung liked it, and he republished it in a book on symbolism. He then told Rivkah to analyze the Gilgamesh epic psychologically. So this was a sort of new subject that had only recently been translated. It was being newly introduced to people at the time. So she worked on this subject for many years, presented her arguments in a seminar in 1962 at the Jung Institute in Zurich, and then later, after her death, her husband edited and published these seminar transcripts as a book in 1991, and it's called The Archetypal Significance of Gilgamesh, an Ancient Modern Hero. So I'll just briefly discuss this book for what it has to offer, and then also use it as a jumping-off point for what I think has been missed and has not been grappled with in this epic. So up front, Scharf announces that she's going to find meaning in this epic through Jung's theories. And she says in the introduction, quote, "Since Jung's discovery of the collective unconscious and its contents, the archetypes, new light has fallen on the essence of myths. Finding mythological motifs turning up in the dreams of modern man, Jung recognized that myths, like dreams, are manifestations of the unconscious." And she goes on to say, quote, "Myths, so far as their origin is concerned, are like dreams, spontaneous expressions of the unconscious. Just as dreams, as Jung has shown, are related in a compensatory way to the current state of the unconscious of the dreamer, so the myths, we may assume, are related to the collective state of consciousness at a certain time. But who is its dreamer? We could presume to say the collective ego of the tribe or populace, that is, the commonly held beliefs and attitudes, the collective consciousness." So you could even put a finer point on this and say basically, in this view, myths are the collective dreams of a group. And Gilgamesh, being the most ancient recorded myth, in Scharf's view, shows human collective consciousness in a more primitive state. And referring to the early period of civilization when this myth emerged, she writes, quote, "One could call such an archaic time the puberty of mankind." And one can see this as condescending, but also not necessarily derogatory from her perspective, since this is a time of high modernism, and modernism involves a sort of exotifying fascination and desire to uncover the primitive. So there are going to be sort of more primal truths revealed here in this more ancient epic. So the book then goes on to basically comment on each incident in the entire course of the epic and see what it reveals about the psychology of Gilgamesh, about the trials that he goes through. And just to give a few strong points of what this framework does offer, it is certainly clear and undeniable that Gilgamesh changes and evolves over the course of this story, and that arguably the change in his thinking and perspective and behavior is more important than any of these adventures he goes on. And it clearly is making points about human evolution and maturation. Also, there's the fact that the epic makes very frequent use of dreams. Almost every important development that happens, like the meeting of Enkidu and Gilgamesh, the defeat of Humbaba, the death of Enkidu, all of these things are presaged by often very elaborate prophetic dreams. And the composers of this epic clearly believed very much in an inner life, as against Schmidt, which I quoted at the beginning of the first lecture, where he claims that the figures of Gilgamesh and Enkidu have no significant interiority. A lot of this story is completely motivated and unfolded through the interior experience of dreams. And so this story lends itself very well to psychological analysis that is largely inspired by dreams. And specifically, I'd go back to that passage that I read earlier, where we see Gilgamesh's dreams of the arrival of Enkidu. And he sees him first in the form of a meteorite and then as an axe. Scharf makes very interesting points about these dreams. As for the meteorite, she points out that this is understood as a sort of fallen star. It came out of the world of the stars. And Babylonia was the homeland of astrology, where it was first taught that the stars determine one's fate, the course of events on Earth, and observations of the stars can serve to predict the future. And so this underscores the fact that this dream represents a fate, a destiny that is coming to Gilgamesh that is really unavoidable. It's sort of fated that these two men are going to come together, and that further that Enkidu will somehow determine Gilgamesh's greater destiny. Then there is the dream where Gilgamesh finds an axe in the square of Uruk. So it's very easy to take a symbol like an axe and figure that it represents violent male power, it's a phallic symbol, and that's all fair enough. And Michael Schmidt, in his book, Gilgamesh, the Life of a Poem, quotes the poet and critic Carol Rumens, who wrote to him about Gilgamesh, quote, "I didn't like it on the whole. I hate male hero stories, the big axes, the implied big penises, and the big egos, a big turnoff." So this, you could say, is a sort of crude Freudian interpretation of this dream of the axe. But Rivkah Scharf points out, I think very shrewdly, that this axe dream is the first of many points in the narrative where Enkidu is compared to sharp implements and weapons. And Scharf quotes the passage in Tablet 8 where Gilgamesh is mourning and grieving over the body of Enkidu, and he describes Enkidu as, quote, "the hatchet at my side, the bow in my hand, the dagger in my belt." And she argues that sharpness, the ability to divide, to split, represents consciousness, judgment, forethought. And even today, we constantly use in our language these terms like a sharp observation, a piercing insight. And even the word analysis, which is what I claim to be doing right now, that word at root means splitting apart or cutting apart. So I think this is a point where Scharf, amusingly, sort of makes her own very keen observation here, that there are different meanings to these things that unfold and develop as you go through the story. And if we look further at the figure of Enkidu, how does he accord with this sort of Jungian scheme of what myths are all about? Well, you could say he seems to fit, in a way, as the shadow of Gilgamesh. The two of them, Enkidu and Gilgamesh, look remarkably similar, and we're told repeatedly that onlookers, as he goes through the shepherding village and into the city, onlookers say he looks just like Gilgamesh. But there are certain differences. He's slightly shorter. He's very broad and strong. He has this long hair. And in various ways, he appears more natural, more earthy. And the two initially confront each other like rivals or enemies, but then quickly embrace and become partners. So this seems to fit with this sort of scheme of the shadow appearing, being confronted, but then being accepted into the person. And I would further add that after Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh does seem in some ways to take on some of Enkidu's qualities. He puts on crude animal skins and wanders out in the wilds, much as Enkidu was described doing at the beginning of his story. And then Gilgamesh sets out on a quest, in his case for immortality, and as his first feat on this journey towards the island where he hopes to find immortality, he fights and kills lions. Just as Enkidu, at the beginning of the story, accepted the quest to go into the city and challenge Gilgamesh, and en route he kills lions, as a hunter protecting the shepherd village. So there are some things that can be clarified or illuminated using this sort of Jungian framework of interpretation. But nonetheless, it has serious limits, and one can see these limits in some of the weaknesses of this book by Scharf about Gilgamesh. So she often puts forward rather forced or strained interpretations, such as arguing that the cedar tree represents the symbolic mother, which Gilgamesh must slay, and that Humbaba, therefore, is a corresponding father figure. There's this sort of drive to reduce the incidents and events of the narrative to kind of personal, family struggles. And further, everything seems to be internalized. Over and over, one figure, one event after another through the whole story is held to represent the unconscious in this sort of broad way. So the people of the city are said to represent unconscious forces. And she writes, quote, "The plurality of the people stands for the unconscious qualities. Ishtar represents the unconscious, which must be defeated by consciousness. The snake represents the unconscious life. And the relationship of Enkidu and Gilgamesh is described as, quote, the union between consciousness and the unconscious." So reading this, it starts to sound like, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's almost as if the story on the literal level doesn't matter. It's all just this psychodrama happening inside Gilgamesh's head. And further, I would say the main central weakness of this book is that she doesn't put forward any larger overarching point to the story. It's just lots of little points interpreting individual incidents, minor characters. There's no bigger, broader statement about what does the story of Gilgamesh tell us. And while it has all these many little short chapters about, now there's Shaduri, and now there's the Scorpion people, and this is what this means psychologically, finally at the end of the book there's a little concluding section titled The Meaning of the Epic, which is less than 2 pages long. And it basically restates a point that she's made earlier in the book, which is the sense of a religious transition. So as we said, she argues that this story comes from a sort of pubescent moment in the development of human consciousness. And so there's a transition from a sort of infantile polytheism to a more mature monotheism. And she says on the second to last page of the book, quote, "The Gilgamesh epic as a whole shows in its inner structure a process of transformation in the collective unconscious, in anticipation of the individuation process represented in the hero. At the same time, it mirrors a significant era in the history of religion, a time when the great goddess Ishtar was defeated by the male hero under the aegis of Shamash, the archetype of consciousness. This marks the beginning of the transition from polytheism to the monotheism of the Bible." So you can see a series of binary oppositions being set up here in alignment. Male versus female, conscious versus unconscious, monotheistic versus polytheistic. And in her view, the narrative represents the beginning, you could say, of the overthrow of the old system to the new. Now, that's a fair enough hypothesis, but it's basically just noted in passing and not really developed with any further comparison to the Hebrew Bible. And for instance, she doesn't take account of what we talked about earlier, that even the Israelite God in the Hebrew Bible can be seen to be divided, ambivalent, fickle, petty, much like the gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in many ways, you can see the Israelite God as being really more similar in many instances to Ishtar, this sort of fickle, petty, tyrannical deity, just as much as, or even more so than, Shamash, the sort of serene, judicious solar god. And what is more, she doesn't seem to say, what does Gilgamesh represent? Is he just the generic hero being sort of put through the generic stages of the hero's journey? Isn't there anything more distinctive about Gilgamesh or what he symbolizes? And there are a lot of strange things missing or off about the narrative as she reconstructs it. So let's say we go back to this Jungian model of psychological development and we say, okay, well, we can grant that Enkidu seems to plausibly fit into the role of this shadow figure, but then we have to ask, where is the anima, who is supposedly like the bigger challenger than the shadow figure? Where is that in this story? It's not Ishtar in Scharf's account because she is completely rebuffed. There is no sense at all of reconciliation or merger between Gilgamesh and Ishtar. And so instead, Scharf casts her as this sort of mother figure who has to be challenged and overthrown in order for the man to become a mature adult. She does then later seize upon the figure of Shiduri, that divine barmaid in the sort of heavenly garden. Twice she says Shiduri is an anima figure. And you may remember that Gilgamesh confronts her in this garden. She takes shelter in her inn. Gilgamesh demands to know the way to find Utnapishtim and immortality, and Shiduri tries to warn him off, telling him to instead enjoy the pleasures of home life and the family. At one point she says, take joy in holding your child's hand in your hand. But Gilgamesh is insistent and he presses on nonetheless. So, okay, is she the anima? She is a female figure who somehow butts heads with Gilgamesh. But she's just one of many figures that Gilgamesh meets of both sexes on the course of his journey. There are the two scorpions who appear to be male and female. And then there's Shiduri in the garden. Then there's Urshanabi, the boatman. And then finally on the island, Utnapishtim and his wife, both of whom together show that Gilgamesh is irreversibly mortal. So Shiduri doesn't appear to stand out as particularly important or different as compared to this series of figures. And in fact, he achieves his sort of final knowledge and insight, not from the confrontation with Shiduri, but from his time on the island with Utnapishtim and his wife. And really, Gilgamesh cannot be said to in any way assimilate the lessons that Shiduri gives him, which is the wisdom of accepting mortality, until after this encounter on the island and then his attempt to return back to Uruk. And moreover, there doesn't seem to be any sort of final reconciliation or union with the feminine in Gilgamesh. And remarkably, there is no mention, even at the end when he returns to Uruk and he's accepted mortality, there's no mention of the possibility of procreation as a means towards immortality. Maybe the historical Gilgamesh had children, maybe not. Either way, no wife or child is ever mentioned in the entire narrative. And in this way, Shiduri's sort of most profound advice of take comfort in holding your wife and your child, it's completely ignored and dropped. And likewise, if we say, okay, the hero's journey is supposed to end with a boon, no boon is achieved and brought back here. Perhaps that might be what the herb at one point in some form of the story could represent, but it is very important that it is lost. And he goes back to Uruk empty-handed, with no new powers or gifts, just a sort of wry acceptance of the common lot of mankind. So in this way, the Jungian framework just doesn't fit this story, because it is not fundamentally a story of journey and return. There are several journeys, right? There's the journey out to the cedar forest and back, and then there's the other journey to Utnapishtim and back, and then there are trials and fights of various sorts along the way and in between. So this is a much more complicated and contradictory narrative. It's also a very vivid story with clashing forces of sex, violence, and power playing out through these multiple episodes and conflicts. And most importantly, I would point out, it takes place in what the original composers understood to be a real time and place. This is not happening in some, alternate fantasy realm. So this Jungian framework fails to take account of this. It fails to take account of the political and historical dimensions of the story, the fact that it claims to be about a real king of a real city, and is not just about personal internal development, but also power. And it fails to take account of the strange structure of the story, which hinges on the relationship between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. That's the sort of central motivating force of it all. And this is a relationship that I think Jungian theory cannot take account of, at least not yet in the language and terms that Scharf knew. Jungian theory can't take account of this except just to say that Enkidu is Gilgamesh's shadow. But clearly this really gives Enkidu short shrift. He's a much more complex, evolving character and figure in his own right. And while Gilgamesh does learn from him and change, and also, as I pointed out, takes on some of his superficial attributes, he does not absorb Enkidu. There's no merger. A major point of this story is that Gilgamesh actually literally loses Enkidu. He is dead and irretrievable. Gilgamesh cannot get him back. Okay, so with all of that in mind, I'd like to then briefly at the end here put forward my own observations about what this story is really about, and most significantly what the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu represents. So I've said before that when it comes to monarchy and royals, personal and political are inseparable, and the bond that we see between Enkidu and Gilgamesh has both personal, psychological, and political symbolism. And the story begins with a sort of eerie symmetry between these two figures, both of whom are in different ways barbaric or base, and they only change and develop and have meaningful lives through their connection and their influence on one another. So others have pointed out that in the opening scenario of this story, there is this uncanny symmetry, where on the one hand we see that Enkidu is part animal. He's unformed, bestial, living in the wild, and he's strange, alien, and unknown to other humans. He has been made out of clay, so he's a sort of creature of the earth, and he's content to live this sort of primitive life among the animals. Whereas, on the other hand, Gilgamesh appears to be the opposite. He's the king of a splendorous city, living in palaces with priests and servants. He is not at all part animal, but rather part divine. Gilgamesh can be seen as representing an archetypal king. He is awe-inspiring, semi-divine, literally in that his mother is a goddess. He's impossibly tall, strong, handsome, fearsome, in all these ways godlike, and he is entitled to service and sex from the people. So kings in this era clearly are seen as godlike. But remember, in this world, gods can be petty, selfish, and volatile, and likewise so can kings. So monarchy, always is a huge gamble in terms of what sort of character and personality you're going to get in your king. And Gilgamesh is not a good king at the start of this story. And there's a further irony here that I haven't seen others point out, in that Gilgamesh is also, in a sense, bestial. Because of his base and untamed character, he is also kind of a wild animal, and he's repeatedly called a bull on the rampage. So in a monarchy, it's always a luck of a draw, whether the ruler happens to have the character to rule well. And it seems the people of Uruk have drawn a bad card. Gilgamesh is brutish and tyrannical. Why is this? Well, we don't know explicitly, but I think it's significant to notice that there is no father figure here for Gilgamesh, and no male role model. He has sort of substitutes, fill-in figures. He appeals sometimes to his ancestor Lugalbanda, who's sort of his patron, but who is long dead, and as far as we see, never intervenes in the story. There's also Shamash, the solar god, who is wise and judicious, but is also very aloof and can't really serve as a role model either. And Gilgamesh's fatherlessness is also something he has in common with Enkidu, as Ninsun at one point explicitly points out. He was raised with no family, no parents. And so both Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they're similar in that they don't seem to know their own limits. They have no humility, no model of how to live or to aspire to. And you can see this resonating, I think, with the common situation where many men who have grown up without father figures or male role models often don't know how to be a mature man. And both of these men, in their different ways, need to be tamed, in the sense of given a vision of something better or higher to aspire to. And this realization, firstly, is forced upon Enkidu when Shamhat introduces him to civilization, and then the wild animals reject him. So he had been blissfully ignorant, But now he sees that he has a higher potential to which to aspire, to be a protector or a hero, and not to just live hedonistically in the wild. Now, Gilgamesh then is also forced into a similar awakening by his encounter with Enkidu. Suddenly, he is no longer the uncontested cock of the walk, and he needs to find some greater meaning and satisfaction in life from something other than dominance and exploitation for pleasure. So both of them are, in a sense, awakened to higher aspirations. So both from their extremes of tyranny on the one hand and base animality on the other must somehow meet in the middle. Enkidu has animal qualities, Gilgamesh has divine qualities, including his caprice, his selfishness, his egotism. So they must come from these different extremes and somehow meet in the middle, an ideal of manhood and strength, which stands between tyranny on the one hand and wild bestial life on the other. And the metaphor in the story for this middle ground or middle way is the shepherd. So if we think of the landscape of the story, there's the city on the one hand with its huge walls and monuments, and the steppe-lands on the other. What is in between? Well, we know that what is in between is the shepherding camp. And this is important right from the start of the story, this metaphor of the shepherd as kind of the middle ground, the compromise. So in the opening of the story, and then repeatedly again, Uruk is called the sheepfold or sheep enclosure. So right away we have this notion that the people of Uruk are in need of a sort of benevolent leader and protector. And by this logic, the king is supposed to be the shepherd of the people. But at the beginning of the plot, we hear that the women of Uruk complain to the gods that Gilgamesh is not acting like a shepherd. In Andrew George's translation, they say to the gods, quote, "Gilgamesh lets no son go free to his father. By day and by night his tyranny grows harsher. Yet he is the shepherd of Uruk the sheepfold. Gilgamesh, the guide of the teeming people, though he is their shepherd and their protector, powerful, preeminent, expert, and mighty, Gilgamesh lets no girl go free to her bridegroom." So there's this disconnect between the social role that the people expect of Gilgamesh as a leader, a protector, and his actual behavior, which is more like a predator or a wolf than a shepherd. And it seems the encounter with Enkidu begins to work the necessary change, where the wolf begins to transform into the shepherd, much as Enkidu, for his part, changed from being a wild animal into the protector of the shepherding camp. So this transformation into the shepherd can also be seen to symbolize becoming a good ruler and further becoming a good mature person, rule over oneself, protection of one's fellows. So there is a political and psychological symbolism here, both intertwined and almost inseparable. So the shepherding camp is the middle ground in between the two extremes. And as we saw, Enkidu sojourns there. He gets on smashingly well with the shepherds. He learns the art of the bow and arrow and of hunting for the purpose of protection. And then Gilgamesh changes with his encounter with Enkidu. So after meeting and forming his bond with Enkidu, his behavior changes. His aggression, which he had directed towards the people of the city, turns outward. So now he proposes to go out and fight faraway monsters rather than the men of the city. And this is his first step in evolution and maturation, arguably becoming civilized in the more abstract and psychological sense, the redirection of the aggressive impulses towards their proper objects. And Enkidu changes too in response. There's a dialectical evolution. So Enkidu gains greater courage and purpose. He's at first terrified of setting out and fighting Humbaba, but Gilgamesh persuades him, and Enkidu in turn instills some degree of prudence in Gilgamesh. Hence the long, elaborate preparations with armor and weapons, which are described in great detail and take up almost an entire tablet. So the two men in their relationship grow more similar as they come in towards this sort of middle ground. They continue to make mistakes, but they gradually become more wise. And furthermore, the people of the city change in their interactions with Gilgamesh. They no longer stand back in awe and fear of him, but they actually begin to advise and consult with him in a passage that I think must be on a more recently discovered tablet, because I didn't see it in Andrew George's translations from 2003, but it does appear in Benjamin Foster's from 2019. In this passage, Gilgamesh consults with the people of the city and asks for their blessing to go on the mission to the cedar forest. So why is it that this encounter or relationship with Enkidu so changes Gilgamesh and sets him on this new path? Well, I think an important key, which is repeated and emphasized in these prophetic scenes leading up to the meeting, it's the equality of the two men. They are equal in almost all conceivable ways, in beauty, size, strength, prowess, and then finally in formal status. So in the dream prophecies, Ninsun tells Gilgamesh that a companion will come to him and will love him, save him, and be loyal to him, and he will be your equal. And when Enkidu is told about Gilgamesh, his response is, I will go into the city and challenge him and change the order of things. And then only after the two men fight and struggle with one another do they become joined together. And then it seems Ninsun fulfills the prophecy by formally adopting Enkidu as a second son equal to Gilgamesh. So this is a whole new sort of relationship for Enkidu, who previously has had no family, and now Gilgamesh is sort of his adoptive brother. And it also is a totally new experience for Gilgamesh, who, as far as we can see, has no father or brother or any peer that we know of. And it's this that inspired him to change. So it's the relationship with Enkidu that becomes the great defining relationship of Gilgamesh's life. And this accounts, for one thing, for why we never hear anything about Gilgamesh marrying, despite his clear sexual interest in women. So he may be attracted to women in Uruk and has preyed upon them sexually, but he never falls in love with any woman, only with Enkidu. And why is this? Well, I think it's clearly because nobody in Uruk could challenge him and relate to him as an equal. Enkidu is the only person he knows who could match him and treat him as an equal. And this is what Gilgamesh needed in order to grow and change. And the relationship with Enkidu takes the place that might have been occupied by a marriage. So this now may raise the question, what exactly is the nature of their bond? And does it have an erotic or romantic dimension like a marriage does? And I would say that the answer, based on a plain reading of the text, is definitely yes. And there are many reasons for this. Just to begin with, even before the two men meet, in the scene where Gilgamesh relates his prophetic dreams about Enkidu, he describes his attraction to these symbolic objects, the meteorite and the axe, and says that he was drawn to them like a woman. And in response, Ninsun says that these objects represent a male companion, and she repeats no less than 3 times, quote, like a wife, you'll love him. So already, off the bat, it's being likened to a marriage. Now, many will say, wait, what are you saying, that they're gay? Or are you saying that their relationship is homosexual? Well, sexuality has long been a problem and an uncomfortable topic in translation and interpretation of the Gilgamesh cycle. It causes a lot of discomfort and squeamishness. For instance, as I mentioned, early translations like Heidel's of the epic left the whole description of sex between Enkidu and Shamhat in Latin, rather than put it into plain English. Now, this part, the sexual encounter between Shamhat and Enkidu, is now discussed more frankly, and you can read it in English. But now the homosexual aspect is what's become controversial. And many surely will rush in and say, you can't say that they're gay or homosexual. That's an anachronism. It's a modern projection. You can't know that they really did anything sexual. It doesn't say that explicitly in the text. And, as is true, they both clearly enjoy sex with women. And you can see this, for example, in Michael Schmidt's book on Gilgamesh, who, is kind of becoming my whipping boy here, but it's a valuable service. But Schmidt, at one point in discussing this relationship, he complains that certain other writers have sort of tried to sexualize the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and he criticizes a translator named Stephanie Dalley, who casts Enkidu as sort of feminine, emphasizes his long hair. And Schmidt says, quote, Dalley's reading, more deliberately than George's, paves the way for the suggestion of a Uranian relationship between Enkidu and Gilgamesh. Some contemporary gay writers and readers cheerfully buy into this reading, even though the 6 days and 7 nights of clearly heterosexual lovemaking in Tablet 1 are repeated at the start of Tablet 2, and no account is given in the poem of homosexual acts. End quote. Okay, so what should we make of this argument? Well, in response, I would say it is true that it would be anachronistic to call these two male figures in the epic gay. People in the ancient world did not think or speak of people as being exclusively homosexual or heterosexual. But ironically, Schmidt then falls into this exact same anachronistic fallacy when he uses the previous incidents of sex with women as evidence that Gilgamesh and Enkidu's relationship is not sexual. So it is common all through the ages for many people to be attracted to both sexes at different points in time and to engage in some sort of erotic intimacy with men, women, or both. It's also significant to notice that both men's interest in women, so Enkidu's engagement with Shamhat and Gilgamesh's sex with women in Uruk, both men's interest in women stops once they become partners to each other. Gilgamesh gives up on his claim of the right of prima nocta with brides in Uruk, and Enkidu's the one who first objects to it. And also Shamhat disappears from the scene, and Enkidu shows no interest in her or any hierodules in the temple or any other women from that point forward. And you can see later there are moments where you might expect this to show up, such as at celebrations, like after the two of them defeat the Bull of Heaven and then go into the palace and have a feast and a celebration. There's no mention of women, and the text just says that they feasted and then went to bed. And then Enkidu has his prophetic dream. So it doesn't even say, did they go to bed together? Sounds possible. And when Enkidu talks about his dream, he tells it to Gilgamesh. But either way, evidently, their relationship and love for each other eclipses all others, right? And all question of sex or marriage with anybody else disappears. Now, having said that, the important question here is not, were they gay, right? That clearly doesn't make any sense. It's meaningless and doesn't fit. But rather, the important question is, does their love for each other, which is so central to this story, does it have a romantic and erotic character? And as I have said, the answer to that is yes. So firstly, physical beauty is a very important quality of both of these men. Each one of them is described as, you might say, a fine specimen of a man, tall, strong, and handsome, and this is clearly part of their mutual attraction. The first thing that they do after wrestling is kiss and clasp hands. And in interpreting Gilgamesh's dreams of Enkidu, his mother Ninsun says clearly that the objects represent a male companion, and she repeats 3 times, quote, like a wife you'll love him, caress and embrace him. So this is significant. She's making explicit that there is physical intimacy here. And I think, for one thing, you can't get much more clear than that, indicating erotic intimacy, short of actually describing appendages going into orifices, which this text simply doesn't do, even in reference to heterosexual couplings like Enkidu and Shamhat. But nobody questions that sex went on there, even though it's not graphically explained exactly what happened. And secondly, even putting all of that aside, even if Gilgamesh and Enkidu don't have sex, let's say, all right, there's no diagram here showing us exactly what they did or didn't do in bed. Even if they did not have sex, the important thing, which this line states explicitly and emphasizes by repetition, is that their love is intimate, including physically, and it is like that between a husband and wife. Now, finally, as we saw, Schmidt claims that there is no explicit reference to homosexual acts in the Gilgamesh cycle. But even this, I would say, is evidently wrong. So the exact meanings of words and phrases in the text is always evolving and being reinterpreted. And the translations that even Schmidt himself names and recognizes as accurate and authoritative have found erotic and even explicitly sexual meanings in certain passages about the intimacy between Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Perhaps most significantly in the story of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, which first appears in an ancient Sumerian form and then was partially translated and incorporated as Tablet 12 of the standard Babylonian recension. In this story, we're told that Enkidu rises from the Netherworld and appears to Gilgamesh. He then warns Gilgamesh that what he has to report about the afterlife is very upsetting, and that if he tells Gilgamesh about the afterlife, they will both sit down and weep. And he then describes his body wasting away. And in Andrew George's translation from 1999, this passage reads, quote, "I, the friend whom you touched, so your heart rejoiced, my body like an old garment the lice devour. Enkidu, the friend whom you touched, so your heart rejoiced, like a crack in the ground is filled with dust." So we're told here that there was touching between the two of them, and the words body and friend, naming the things that Gilgamesh supposedly touched, are in italics in this passage, which denotes words of uncertain meaning. So naturally I found this intriguing and thought, what exactly is going on here? Is there any more clarity about what these words are? So I looked in Andrew George's translation from 4 years later, from 2003, which is longer. It's understood to be more precise. It has more knowledge and information about the standard Babylonian text and words and etymology incorporated into it. So I checked that later edition by the same translator to see if there was any more clarity in this passage. And in this translation, the passage reads, quote, "My friend, the penis that you touched so your heart rejoiced, grubs devour it like an old garment. My friend, the crotch that you touched so your heart rejoiced is filled with dust like a crack in the ground." So I don't know exactly why these words changed like this, but words that were previously translated in more general terms, friend and body, are now much more specific, penis and crotch. And I don't know if this is based on some new knowledge or argument about the meanings of certain words in the text, but it does make some sense when you consider that the analogy of a crotch to a crack in the ground is a closer match. It's a better metaphor than simply saying my body is filled with dust like a crack in the ground. Now, as I mentioned, this passage in Tablet 12, all of Tablet 12 of the Standard Babylonian Recension, is a translation of a borrowed section from a much older Sumerian narrative poem. And it happens that Benjamin Foster includes his translation of this passage in his 2019 edition of Gilgamesh. So I looked it up and said, all right, what does this passage say in this very ancient text according to Benjamin Foster? So in his translation, we have Enkidu address Gilgamesh, and he again says, "If I tell you the way things are in the netherworld, you will be sitting there weeping. I will be sitting there weeping too. The penis that when you felt it, you were thrilled. That penis is there like a rotten timber. Vermin eat it. The sweet spot that you said of it, where is it? Let me at it. That sweet spot is there like a crack in parched ground, full of dust." Okay, so I think that should put to bed pretty conclusively the question of whether the ancient writers saw Gilgamesh and Enkidu as being lovers. Now, another question you might ask then is, well, what does this matter? What does it matter if they were lovers or whether there was sexual contact here? Well, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. But certainly, if nothing else, it does underscore the closeness and intensity of the bond between the two men, which is, as I would say again, the central force in this whole story. And asking whether it matters that they were lovers is also kind of weird when you consider, do we ask if it matters whether Romeo and Juliet were lovers? Does it matter whether Adam and Eve were lovers? We just take for granted. So in the case of Romeo and Juliet or Tristan and Isolde, we just take it for granted. Of course it's important to understanding the story and understanding the characters' extreme reckless actions. And when we look at the Gilgamesh cycle, Enkidu is clearly the love of Gilgamesh's life, and hence the extreme grief that disrupts Gilgamesh's life and reign. and furthermore, the recklessness of many of his other actions. For instance, Gilgamesh's vehement rejection and denunciation of Ishtar, and then following that, Enkidu's violent taunting of the goddess, even throwing her own bull's leg back at her and threatening to harm her as well. Why would they react in this vehement and dangerous way? Well, if you see them as lovers, it's not so surprising. For one thing, you could say Enkidu was furious beyond reason because Ishtar is trying to take his man. This is a love triangle. And I think it also has important ramifications for how we understand the point of the whole story. For one thing, it clarifies the importance of Enkidu in redirecting Gilgamesh's impulses. So firstly, his sexual instinct is redirected away from the brides in Uruk to a lover and companion whom Gilgamesh does not control or exploit, but loves as an equal. And similarly, his violent instincts are redirected away from weaker, powerless subjects within Uruk, outward to more powerful and threatening opponents. First Humbaba in the forest, and then the Bull of Heaven, both of whom he defeats in a partnership with Enkidu. So he doesn't become peaceable, right? He doesn't become a philosopher. He is still a fighter, but he is redirecting his violent aggression towards better targets. Ultimately, the only opponent that Gilgamesh cannot defeat is mortality itself, which Gilgamesh learns to face and reckon with due to his grief over losing Enkidu. So Enkidu is still, in a sense, the motivator. So in this light, I think you can see that the relationship with Enkidu demarcates the story into a basically three-part structure. And the three-part structure is not the departure, initiation, and return of the hero's journey as described by Joseph Campbell. Rather, it's 3 stages of development separated by the milestones in his relationship with Enkidu. First, the meeting with Enkidu, and then the death of Enkidu. So these events separate the story into 3 stages in which Gilgamesh evolves and his motives and objectives change. And you can compare them, I think, to the sort of 3 basic human motives that are traditionally delineated in Hindu philosophy, which I've talked about in my lecture on Hinduism. And those are dharma, artha, and kama. Basically, dharma, the spiritual and moral life, the striving for immortality, escape from the power of the cycle of death and rebirth. And that is considered to be the highest, most ennobling objective. Then there is artha, worldly ambition, political success. And then kama, sensuality, right? The pleasures of the senses, of food and sex and luxury. So these are all considered to be valid and legitimate objectives, but they are ordered in a hierarchy of value, from dharma to artha to kama. Now, Gilgamesh, I think you can say, ascends through these 3 stages. So initially, at the beginning of the story, he's a ruler who simply takes pleasure in sex, in sports. He is just luxuriating in power and luxury. Then with his relationship with Enkidu, he becomes ambitious. He wants to set out and do something noteworthy to make a name that will last. And that starts with the expedition to the cedar forest to obtain the materials to build and beautify the city. Then with the death of Enkidu, he leaves the city behind temporarily, and he goes out in search not only of immortality, but of an understanding of life, what you might in today's phrasing say is the meaning of life, right? So he advances from kama to artha to dharma, right? His story captures the basic idea, sometimes expressed in philosophy even today, that mortality is the great tragedy of life. The fact that you will lose everyone and everything that you love, but at the same time it also brings meaning to human action, and it lifts people's thinking from the earthly to the spiritual. It leads people to question what is the meaning of life. So this is the through line, I think, as far as Gilgamesh. Now, what about Enkidu then? Is he just a catalyst for Gilgamesh? Is he just Gilgamesh's shadow, as we discussed earlier? No, I do not think so. He clearly is more important and complex than that. His own journey and background are also important to the meaning of the story. So one can see clearly he does go through a dramatic and visible evolution from a naked man of the wild to a hunter among the shepherding people, and then to a hero and sort of co-ruler of the city. And he's sometimes been taken by anthropologists to symbolize gradualism, the idea that civilization arose in distinct stages, right, from hunting and gathering to nomadic shepherding and then to settled agriculture and urban life. But I think that this is not quite right either, because the civilization was always there, and that's actually where the story begins. And Enkidu just has to enter it. This is what brings on the drama of the story, Enkidu's entry into Uruk. And in a way, he takes the wild with him into the city. He continues to be in some ways part wild, and his relationship with Gilgamesh is what inspires the king then to turn outward and leave and set out into the wild. So Enkidu is clearly an important symbol unto himself, as well as a catalyst for the story. And I would say that he represents the nomadic people outside the cities, both hunter-gatherers and pastoralists, who had a sort of uneasy or volatile relationship with urban civilization. So remember, this epic was first developed at a time when civilization was still relatively new, right? Certainly compared to today. And the cities of Sumer relied on food from intensive agriculture based on irrigation, basically confined just within the banks of the great rivers. But these cities in Sumer were surrounded by deserts, steppelands, and mountains, which were still inhabited by migratory animal herders, and maybe even still some hunter-gatherers, who continued to range over most of the lands of the earth. So these cities can be seen as just islands, or an archipelago of urban life amidst a sea of migratory peoples on the open expanses, from whom the urban people often obtained trade goods or knowledge of the landscape. And you can see in the story, I think, an enduring feeling of insecurity and also of attraction to the wild lands. And according to a footnote that appears in Benjamin Foster's book, apparently the city god, which was common in ancient times, each city would have its protector, its patron deity. The city god of Babylon performed a seasonal migration. So probably there was a ceremonial procession that brought the figure of the god in and out of the city. And it was sent out in later seasons of the year to rusticate in the steppes, and then was brought back into the city in the New Year's festival. So there's this sense that the city and the open lands are kind of still tied. And in the text of the epic, Gilgamesh explicitly likens his journey to the forest, which he wants to set out on, to this seasonal cycle of errand and return back to the city. So he's trying to establish a sort of double life here, right, with a foot inside the city and outside. And in the story, I think Enkidu can be seen as symbolizing the rural and nomadic peoples. So before coming into the city, he has lived, as we said, as a wild man among animals, which may be how the urban people sort of perceived the distant hunter-gatherers who had no fixed abode and lived like the animals. But he also, by the time he gets into the city, he's also learned the basics of the quasi-nomadic, quasi-sedentary pastoral life, involving the protection of animal herds and the making of bread and beer. So Enkidu in the myth, I think, can represent the sort of freedom and simple virtue that urban dwellers could associate with the rural hunting and gathering and animal herding peoples. And he can be seen as a kind of early forerunner of the noble savage myth, right, that became popular from the 1700s onward. But I think also there are maybe elements of realism in Enkidu and his behavior. So he may not just be a projection of the noble savage. As has been pointed out in recent years, the advent of urban civilization involved a complex trade-off, and it was certainly not an unalloyed good. And many nomadic peoples in history have refused to settle down to cooperate in the transition to agriculture or urban life in exchange for the material advantages of life in the city, even as they may trade extensively with the urban people. And specifically in cities like Uruk, which were based on irrigation, it seems that elites tended to be very strong, And the entire population, both in the cities themselves and in the agricultural lands around them, depended on massive public works overseen by powerful rulers and state organs. So Gilgamesh's tyranny at the beginning of this cycle would not be unusual in that context. Additionally to that, urban living might ensure certain material abundance and security, but it also brought new dangers, such as crowd diseases, which fester in the crowded and closed cities. And I think it is no accident here that Enkidu, after coming into the city and settling in the urban environment, falls sick and dies while still fairly young. This probably reflects a very common occurrence of people who resettled into cities. But this is also not to say, of course, that urban society had no appeal. Otherwise, it never would have grown and flourished. And what it had to offer included wealth and splendor. And I think much of its appeal also was the possibility of taking part in great achievements and grand endeavors, which is what Enkidu is able to do once he goes into Uruk and joins up with Gilgamesh. So Enkidu, I think, can be seen to represent and even express the ambivalence of nomadic pastoralists towards the allures and the dangers of the city. And I think a great centerpiece, really, of the whole cycle. And as I've said, there are many speeches, and a lot of the great, powerful language in this whole cycle is in the speeches. But arguably the great centerpiece in the middle of the cycle is Enkidu's lament on his deathbed, which captures, I think, a lot of the ambivalence about urban life. So when Enkidu is in sickbed and realizes that he's going to die, he appeals and prays to Shamash, the sun god, and then he starts to curse and condemn the people that he resents and blames for his fate, beginning with the hunter and trapper, who first kind of turned him into the authorities, you could say. And then he curses Shamhat, the hierodule who seduced him. And he says in part, "Come, Shamhat, I will ordain you a destiny. Swiftly, inexorably, may my curse come upon you. May you never make a home that you can enjoy. May you never caress a child of your own. May you never be received among decent women. May the ground besmirch your best garment. May the drunkard bespatter your best clothes in the dust." And he goes on, "May vacant lots be your sleeping place. May the shade of a wall be your counting house. May brambles and thorns flay your feet. May the lawful wife scream at you when you meet." So you can see this as a description of kind of the danger of the fate that temple prostitutes might face as they age out. And then he concludes, "May one whose loins are putrid be your lover, because you diminished me, an innocent. Yes, me, an innocent, you diminished me in my step." So now he regrets leaving the wilds, right, and coming into the city at all. Now, at this point, the sun god Shamash, who, as we said, represents order, justice, wisdom, he objects and tells Enkidu this is unfair. And he says, "Why curse Shamhat the harlot, who gave you bread to eat, fit for a god, who poured you beer, fit for a king, who dressed you in a noble garment, and gave you handsome Gilgamesh for a comrade?" So Shamash is reminding him, you're enjoying all of these splendid things that you never knew in the wilds, and the sort of great crowning gift of it all is the relationship with Gilgamesh, which I think we can see clearly here represents the relationship, right? The connection, the bond between the rural people and the city, between the free life of the steppes and urban life. And apparently this works. So Enkidu responds and he rescinds his curses upon Shamhat and says, "Come, Shamhat, I will ordain you a destiny. My mouth that cursed you, let it bless you instead. May governors and dignitaries fall in love with you. May the man 1 double league away slap his thighs in excitement. May the man 2 double leagues away be letting down his hair. May the soldier not hold back from you, but open his trousers. May he pay you with obsidian, lapis, and gold. May fancy granulated ear bangles be your compensation." So now we have this vivid reversal, right, of the wealth, the splendor that can come from the successful career of a hierodule. But you might sense also here a possible irony, right, that he's also kind of mocking her, that she is literally prostituting herself for baubles and gold. And perhaps part of this irony is self-deprecating, right? That he is sort of accepting that he too has been seduced into the city and into the palace and given up his freedom or his dignity in return for fineries. So however you read it, I think this really ambivalent exchange between Enkidu and Shamash encapsulates what you could see as the ambivalence that comes with the trade-offs of civilized life, right? And the relationship between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, which begins when he first challenges and fights Gilgamesh, but then falls in love with him, this can represent the ambiguous and shifting relationship between the urban and nomadic peoples. So the story overall, I think, traces a conceptual shift, right, from simple opposition of freedom in pastoral life versus urban tyranny towards an attempt at a synthesis, a civic and political order, which begins to develop after these two men come together and change and elevate one another. So really, I think this is why I'm saying I believe this is a story of what it means to be civilized, which is not just a matter of law and order, but a matter of balance, of negotiation between the appeal of the city and that of the wild. And the two men in their relationship personify a vision of empire as a partnership of center and periphery. And hence the irony, I think, of the repeated lines about the walls of the city. So these can be taken to demarcate the boundaries of civilization and to protect it against the forces of the wild, and hence, obviously, why they are an object of pride. But in the second telling at the end, there's a lot of irony. We know that these walls, no matter how grand and impressive, they cannot replace what has been lost. They cannot undo the fact of loss and mortality. And also, we can see at this point that what made Gilgamesh's life meaningful and memorable was not so much that he built big walls, but rather it was the things that passed through the gates of the walls, in and out of the enclosure of the city. Enkidu coming in from the wild, and then the two venturing out in search of adventure and then of knowledge. And hence, I think a civilized life, in this view, should involve venturing beyond the walls, beyond the safety and luxury of civilization. And that, in fact, civilization and the wilds are complementary. They give value and meaning to one another. They elevate one another. So the good society embodies an ideal, a balancing, a complementarity of the urban and the rural, of civilization and nature, of instinct and cultivation, and of the earthly and the heavenly. And in this way, it is a larger representation, an outward projection of the balance between the animal and the divine in human nature. And this, I think, is what it means in this view to be civilized, and hence why I would say this is the myth of civilization. So thank you again for listening. Thank you to my patrons. And as I said, this lecture is brought to you by the letter Z. So I'd like to specifically thank my current active patrons whose names begin with Z, Zachary Talbot, and ZMK5. Thank you.